Step into a realm where mystery and wonder reign, where the mind's secrets intertwine with ancient knowledge's shadows. Welcome to The Mental Science by Thomas Troward, a captivating voyage into the depths of the human psyche, where reality merges with imagination and mental prowess holds the key to transformation. Picture yourself entering a world where Troward's words act as enchantments, unveiling truths veiled for ages. With each turn of the page, forgotten mysteries are whispered, and dormant inner forces are awakened from their slumber in the darkness. Are you prepared to navigate the hidden corridors of your mind and decipher its mysteries? As Troward leads you through the labyrinth of mental science, you'll be immersed in a sea of possibilities where reality bends to the will of thought. Ancient techniques and timeless wisdom await, empowering you to harness your mind's power, challenge conventional laws, and broaden the horizons of your existence. This text transcends mere storytelling. It serves as a gateway to uncharted territories where the line between the tangible and the ethereal fades. Brace yourself for an enthralling and enigmatic journey, guided by Troward's words as they illuminate the secret pathways of your mind. Will you dare to venture beyond the threshold and unlock the mental science that will reshape your perception of the world? Embrace the darkness, expand your mind, and uncover the magic that lies within. Chapter 1. Mind and Matter. Starting to develop the subject of this book can be done from several points, each with its advantages and disadvantages. After careful consideration, I decided to begin with the theme of the relationship between the spiritual and the material. We choose this starting point because we can assume that we all agree, understand, and have a clear idea of the distinction between these two terms, the spiritual and the material. The opposition between these two terms is verified with sufficient precision, even with an exclusively superficial look. We are convinced that reality is judged by outward appearances and by certain limited senses of words. However, when we begin to question the true meaning of our words and what these appearances are, the old notions begin to collapse. We realize that we live in a world very different from what we thought we knew. Slowly, the old way of thinking fades away, revealing a new order of things where freedom and life reign. This is how creative intelligence acts, with the determination to discover what truth really is, disregarding any preconceived notion or canons of the past, and thinking honestly for ourselves. To see where our discoveries lead us, let's start by actually asking ourselves the question, what does the vitality we attribute to the spiritual and the inertia with which we determine the material mean? The first thing we must say is that vitality consists of the power of movement and inertia in its absence. But we know from all that physics teaches us that this distinction does not exist in an absolute sense. The basis of the material is pure vibration, pure movement. Today we all know that, for example, this chair on which we are sitting is composed of atoms vibrating at an extremely high speed. They are in a state of activity such that no fertile imagination can conceive matter like this wooden chair on which we are sitting. Apparently inert, but we know that if we look deeper, it is composed of tiny particles moving at such a speed that the speed of an express train is nothing in comparison. So, the characteristic of movement does not serve us to distinguish between the spiritual and the material. Therefore, we will have to go a little further. The solution to our problem would never be found by comparing vitality to inertia. The key would be to think in terms of degrees of vitality. On the one hand, we can think that the amount of vitality does not admit degrees, but the quality can. No one doubts the life of a plant, but we realize that it is different from the life of an animal and that of a human being. However, the plant, the animal, and the human are equally alive. But between them, there is a difference in quality that no one doubts. One difference is the degree of intelligence in any sense that we seek vitality. In every living individual, we discover that this activity is ultimately related to intelligence. It is the presence of this intelligence that differentiates plant life from animal and human life. The increase in intelligence corresponds to a mode of activity of a higher order. The higher the intelligence, the greater the control of the mode of activity. And as we descend the scale of intelligence, we observe an increase in automatic activity, not subject to the self-conscious control of intelligence. This descent gradually goes from the extended recognition of self-realized human personality to the lowest visible form that we call things, where self-recognition is totally absent. As we can see, the vitality of life consists of intelligence. In other words, in the power of thought, we can say that the distinctive quality of the spiritual is thought, and conversely, we can say that the distinctive quality of the material is form. We cannot conceive the material without form, every form occupying a corresponding space. Therefore, form implies extension in space and also restriction within certain limits. Thought implies the opposite. When we think of life as existing in a particular form, we associate it with the idea of extension in space, as if an elephant, for example, consisted of a larger amount of living substance than a mouse. But if we think of life as a fact of vitality, we do not associate it with any idea of extension, and understand at the same time that the mouse is as alive as the elephant, despite the difference in size. The important point in this distinction is that if we can conceive of something as entirely devoid of the element of extension in space, it must be present everywhere in its entirety, which is to say, at every point in space simultaneously. On the other hand, a scientific definition of time says that it is the period occupied by a body moving from one point in space to another. According to this definition, when space is absent, there is no time. Therefore, the conception of the spiritual, which we have defined as devoid of elements involved in space, is also devoid of temporal elements. Thus, we find ourselves with the conception of the spiritual as pure thought, not as a concrete form, and it subsists perfectly independently of the elements of time and space. It follows that the idea of something conceived as existing at this level can only be represented as something that is currently present here and now. Furthermore, from this viewpoint, it cannot be distant from us either in time or in space. So either this idea is completely erroneous, or an entity is currently present, not as something that will be in the future or has been in the past, because where there is no temporal sequence, there is neither past nor future nor distant from us, because where there is no space, there is no distance that separates. When the elements of time and space are eliminated from all our ideas of things, they begin to subsist in a universal here and an eternal now. This is undoubtedly a very abstract conception, but I want to urge the reader to strive to fully understand it, as it is of vital importance in the practical application of mental science, as we will see later. The opposite conception would be that things are expressed through the conditions of time and space, establishing a variety of relationships such as volume, distance, direction, or temporal sequence. These two conceptions are respectively the conception of the abstract and the concrete, the unconditional and the conditioned, the absolute and the relative. They are not opposed in the sense of incompatibility, but in that of complementarity, and the only reality is the combination of the two. The error of extreme idealists is to try to understand the absolute without the relative, and the error of extreme materialists is to try to understand the relative without the absolute. On one side, the error is trying to understand the inside without the outside, and on the other, trying to understand the outside without the inside. Both are necessary in the formation of the substantial entity. Chapter 2. Higher Degrees of Intelligence, Controlling the Lower. We have seen that the descent of personality, as we know it in ourselves, to matter as we know it under what we call inanimate forms, is a gradual slope on the scale of intelligence. From the mode of being capable of realizing its own will, understood as an ability to initiate new chains of causes, to the mode of being incapable of fully recognizing itself. A greater degree of life corresponds to a greater intelligence. We conclude that the supreme principle of life must also be the fundamental principle of intelligence. This is clearly demonstrated by the great natural order of the universe in the light of modern science. The principle of evolution is familiar to us, and the adjustment between all parts of the cosmic scheme is so obvious in itself that it is unnecessary to insist further. Every advance of science consists in discovering new, subtle connections in the magnificent universal order that has always existed and awaits only our recognition so that we can make practical use of it. If the most important task of scientists is simply to recognize the existing order, it is not difficult to conclude that maximal intelligence must be inherent in the principle of life that manifests in this order. Thus, we can see that there must be a great cosmic intelligence underlying all things. The physical history of our planet shows us first a glowing nebula dispersed in the immensity of space, then its condensation into a central sun surrounded by a family of bright planets composed of raw material still little consolidated. Then, the succession of countless millennia of slow geological formation, with an Earth inhabited by the smallest forms of plant and animal life. Through a majestic, incessant and gradual movement, growth occurs step by step, from a rudimentary beginning to the condition we now know. Observing this continuous progression, it is clear that, however we may conceive the nature of the evolutionary principle, it is infallible in providing a continuous advance of species. It does so by creating sets of each class, so that despite a wide range of individual errors, the species nevertheless continues with as much care for the singular type of life. In short, we can say that cosmic intelligence works with the law of averages, which allows for a margin of accident and error for the individual. But progress toward higher intelligence always goes in the direction of limiting this margin of accident. It places the individual more and more outside the law of averages and puts it under the law of individual selection. In scientific terms, this is called survival of the fittest. On one side of the scale we have, for example, the reproduction of fish that could fill the ocean if every individual survived, but whose margin of destruction is enormous as a result. Thus, the law of averages simply maintains the normal proportion of the species, but on the other side of the scale, we find that reproduction does not exceed the survivors as much. There is a wide range of accidents and diseases that limit the number of human beings exceeding the average lifespan, but it is on a very different scale from premature destruction of hundreds of thousands for the survival of one. Therefore, it can be considered an established fact that proportionally to the advancement of intelligence, the individual ceases to be subject to a simple law of averages and has a continuously increasing power to control the conditions of its own survival. Therefore, we see that there is a clear distinction between cosmic intelligence and individual intelligence. The factor that differentiates the latter from the former is the presence of individual will. The task of mental science is to determine the relationship between the power of individual will and the great cosmic law that ensures the maintenance and advancement of the species. The point we must carefully examine is that the power of individual will itself emerges from the cosmic principle of evolution. At the point where it reaches its highest level, nature's effort has always been to progress from less complex life forms to the production of a being endowed with a mind capable of abstract reasoning and a brain suited as an instrument for this mind. At this level, the creative vital principle reproduces itself in a form capable of understanding the work of the law of evolution and unity, and the continuity of purpose that runs through the complete progression indicated above. Undoubtedly, instead of this being in the universal scheme, it should introduce the operation of a factor that, up to this point, had not been seen, a factor called individual intelligent will. The evolution that has brought us to this point has worked with the cosmic law of averages. This process has been a process in which the individual itself has not consciously participated. However, because it is what it is and follows the line of the evolutionary process, if man is to evolve further, it can now only happen through his own conscious cooperation with the law that has brought him to this point, where he is capable of understanding that this law exists. This future evolution must be a conscious participation in the great work, and this can only be accomplished by his own intelligence and effort. This is the process of intelligent development. No one can grow for us, each must do it for themselves, and this intelligent development consists in the increase of our recognition of the universal law that has brought us to where we are, and of our individual relationship with the law, based on the fact that we are its most advanced product. Nature obeys us proportionally to how we obey it. If the electrician tries to oppose the principle that electricity always flows from a higher potential to a lower potential, he will get nothing in return. Conversely, if he submits to this principle in all his tasks, he can make any application of electrical power he wishes. These considerations show that high and low degrees of intelligence differ by the recognition of their own being, and the greater the intelligent recognition, the greater the power. The low degree of self-recognition is one in which one knows oneself only as a separate entity from all other entities, where the ego is distinguished from the non-ego. But the highest degree of self-recognition is one that knows its own spiritual nature and sees in all other forms, not so much the non-ego or what is not the same, but an alter ego or what is the same in a different mode of expression. It is the high degree of self-recognition that is the power by which the mental scientist produces his results. For this reason, it is imperative that he understands the difference between form and being, the former being the modality of the relative and the mark of submission to conditions, and the latter being the truth of the absolute and which controls the conditions. This high degree of self-recognition as individualization of pure mind should necessarily control all other modalities of mind that have not yet reached it. These lower modalities of mind are subject to the law of their own being because they do not know it. Therefore, the individual who has acquired this knowledge can control these modalities by this law. But to understand this, we should investigate the nature of mind. I have already spoken of the adaptation and adjustment of all parts of the cosmic scheme to each other, implying the presence somewhere of a wonderful intelligence beneath the whole. The question would then be, where could we find this intelligence? Currently, we can only conceive of it as inherent in a primordial substance that is the root of all gross forms of matter that we know, whether visible to the naked eye or necessarily inferred by science because of its perceptible effects. This power, which in every species and in every individual becomes what the species or individual is, can only be conceived as a self-forming intelligence inherent in the ultimate substance of which everything is its particular manifestation. This primordial substance must be considered self-forming by a permanent inherent intelligence in itself, for it is evident that intelligence is the essential quality of mind, and if we conceive of the primordial substance as independent of mind. So we should postulate that there is another power than neither mind nor matter, and that originated both, but this is only to entertain the idea of an automatic development power. Taking a step back, and positing the production of a lesser degree of undifferentiated mind by a higher one are both gratuitous assertions and a contradiction. Ultimately, no matter what idea we may form of undifferentiated mind, no matter how far back we may retreat, we may relegate the original starting point, but we cannot avoid the conclusion that at this point the mind contains the primary substance within itself, which leads us to the idea that it makes everything out of nothing. Thus we find two factors that make all things, mind and nothingness, and adding nothing to mind leaves us with mind, x plus u, x. From these considerations, we see that the ultimate foundation of all forms of matter is mind, and from there that a universal intelligence persists throughout nature, inherent in each of its manifestations. But this cryptic intelligence does not belong to the particular form, except to the extent that it is physically capable of concentrating into self-conscious individuality. It is hidden in the primordial substance from which the visible form is a coarse manifestation. This primordial substance is a philosophical necessity, and we can conceive it only as something infinitely subtler than atoms, which are themselves a philosophical inference of physical science. To put it better, we will call this primary intelligence inherent in the substance of all things atomic intelligence. This term may perhaps raise objections, but it will serve us for now to distinguish this mode of intelligence from the mind of its opposite pole, or individual intelligence. This distinction must be clearly noted because it is through the response of atomic intelligence to individual intelligence that the power of thought can produce results on the material plane, as in the healing of diseases through mental treatment, etc. Intelligence manifests through its ability to respond, and the total action of cosmic mind in the production of the evolutionary process from its beginning to the current human state is nothing but a continuous intelligent response to the demand which, at each stage of progression, has required an adjustment between itself and its environment. We can thus recognize the presence of a universal intelligence permeating all things, and also recognize the corresponding hidden capacity for response deep within its nature, ready to be called into action when summoned. All mental treatment depends on the mind's capacity for response, both in its lower and higher degrees. This is the difference between a mental scientist and an uneducated person. The educated one knows this capacity for response and uses it. The other does not use it because they do not know it. Chapter 3. The Unity of Mind. Let us now pave the way to understanding what we mean by the unity of mind. In the initial conception of mind as the underlying origin of all things, we have a universal substance which, at this level, is undifferentiated into any specific form. It is not a matter of some past time, but it subsists always at every moment in the innermost nature of all beings, and when we see this, we notice that beneath the division between one specific form and another, there is a deep essential unity acting as the support of all the different forms of individuality emerging from it. And as our thought penetrates deeply into the nature of the spiritual substance, we will see that it is not limited by any portion of space, but is limitless like space itself, and it is impossible to conceive of the idea of a portion of space where it is not. This is one of those intuitive perceptions from which the human mind can never stray, that this living, primal, generative spirit is forever bound up with the infinite and the universal. It is a mathematical truth that the infinite must be a unity. You cannot have two infinities, for then it would no longer be infinite. Each infinity would be limited by the other. Similarly, you cannot divide it into fractions. The infinite is a fundamental mathematical unity. From there we can draw important consequences. Unity cannot be multiplied or divided without destroying that unity. Through multiplication, we obtain a plurality of units at the same scale as the original, while through division, we produce a plurality of units on a smaller scale. However, a plurality of units is not a unity, but a multiplicity. By leaving behind the external nature of the individual and reaching the innermost principle of his being, from which his individuality emerges, we transcend the conception of individual existence to reach the plane of the unity of universal being. This may seem like a mere philosophical abstraction, but the student seeking to produce practical results must understand that these abstract generalizations are the basis of his work. The great fact of recognizing unity is that as it is singular, wherever it is, it must be fully present. When we allow our minds to connect with the idea of extension and say that part of the unity is here and another there, we descend from the idea of unity to the idea of parts, of fractions of the simple unity. This amounts to adopting the idea of the multiplicity of small units, thus beginning to engage with the relative, that is, with two or more entities mutually limiting each other, thereby losing the realm of simple unity, which is that of the absolute. It is therefore mathematically necessary that, since the originating vital principle is infinite, it must be a singular unity. Thus, wherever it is, it must be fully present, for being infinite or boundless, it is everywhere. We conclude that the entirety of mind must be present at every point in space simultaneously. Mind is omnipresent in its entirety, and in accordance with that, at every moment, all mind is concentrated at every point in space where we choose to direct our thought. This is a fundamental fact of all being, and this is why I have established a connection between mind and matter, and that between idea and form. On one side, the absolute where time and space are absent, and on the other, the relative which depends entirely on these elements. Pure mind continuously subsists in the absolute, whether or not in a physical body, and from it emanates the entire phenomenon of being, both on the mental and physical planes. The knowledge of this fact concerning mind is the foundation of all conscious spiritual operation. Therefore, proportionally to our increase in recognition of this, our power to produce results in the external, through the action of our thought, will increase. The whole is greater than the parts, and thus, if we recognize this unity and focus on mind, we will embrace an individualization of it with which we can desire to deal. The practical importance of this is so evident that it does not deserve deep explanation. Pure mind is the vital principle considered outside of the matrix with which it binds to time and space in a particular manner. In this aspect, it is pure and undifferentiated intelligence within individuality. As pure intelligence, it has an infinite degree of response. Since it has no relationship with time and space, it lacks individual personality. In this aspect, it is purely impersonal, and due to its inherent intelligence and responsiveness, we can imprint upon it any personality recognition we desire. These are the great facts with which the mental scientist works, and the student would do well to deeply reflect on their significance and the responsibility he will have to assume in achieving his accomplishments. Chapter 4. Subjective and Objective Mind. So far, we have laid the foundations of science based on highly abstract general principles reached by purely metaphysical reasoning. Now, we will delve into the consideration of certain natural laws established by a series of experiments and observations. The importance and significance of these laws will become clear when we see their application to the general principles we have discussed so far. The phenomenon of hypnosis has been widely accepted scientifically, so it is not necessary to discuss its credibility. 2 major medical schools have been founded on this subject, and in some countries, hypnosis is subject to legislation. The question that concerns us now is not the credibility of the facts, but the correct inferences we can draw from them. A proper understanding of these phenomena will be of great assistance to the mental scientist, as it can confirm conclusions derived from a priori reasoning by experimental instances supporting them beyond any doubt. One of the great truths that the science of hypnosis has revealed is the dual nature of the human mind. Different authors diverge on the question of whether this duality results from the action of 2 distinct minds within the same person or from the different functions within the same mind. However, this distinction is a false dichotomy that can hinder the search for truth. Ultimately, an individual must be a singularity to be considered human, and the resulting image is the same, whether we conceive its different forms of mental action as arising from several minds within a single personality or from various functions within a single mind. In both cases, we are faced with a singularity, and how we imagine the workings of the mental mechanism is merely a matter of which image of the nature of this action seems clearer and more familiar to us. Therefore, for the sake of convenience, I will speak of this dual action as thoughts arising from 2 minds, one external and the other internal. We will call the internal mind the subjective mind and the external mind the objective mind, as these terms are most commonly used to denote this distinction in specialized literature. An extensive series of carefully conducted experiments by highly qualified observers, some of them globally recognized, has established certain important differences between the action of the subjective mind and the objective mind, which can be summarized as follows. The subjective mind is capable of deductive reasoning, but not inductive, while the objective mind can perform both types of reasoning. Deductive reasoning involves inferring a necessary conclusion from 2 accepted premises, but it does not help determine whether these premises are true. This is the domain of inductive reasoning, which relies on the observation of a series of facts to arrive at a general conclusion. The subjective mind only follows the deductive method and cannot perform the selections and comparisons necessary for the inductive process. It would accept any suggestion, even if false, and would be strictly logical in deducing the conclusions, extracting from each accurate result that follows from it. The subjective mind is under the complete control of the objective mind with absolute fidelity. The subjective mind reproduces and acts to its last consequences any impression that the objective mind impresses upon it, whether from another person or from one's own individuality. This fact is crucial because it shows us that the phenomenon of healing, both in the presence and absence, depends on gentle suggestions through the thought of another under the control of a hypnotist. A subject's personality can temporarily change under the control of a hypnotist, believing to be what the hypnotist tells them to be, and even playing their role with precision. However, hypnotism experiments go further in showing that the subjective mind possesses abilities that transcend what the objective mind can accomplish through physical senses. This reveals transcendent faculties such that, when developed and consciously controlled, they open up new spheres of life. It is important to emphasize that this control must come from oneself and not from an external intelligence, whether embodied or not. Perhaps the most significant factor that hypnotism experiments have revealed is that the subjective mind is the builder of the body. This subjective entity in the patient is capable of diagnosing its own illness and suggesting appropriate remedies, showing a deep understanding of the relationship between disease, organ state, and corresponding remedies. Many cases have been observed in which, without physical remedies, complete restoration of the organism is achieved through suggestions of perfect health made by a hypnotist to the patient in a hypnotic state. These facts are firmly established by hundreds of experiments conducted by researchers in different parts of the world. From this, two highly important inferences can be drawn. First, that the subjective mind is entirely impersonal, as evidenced by its ability to assume any role impressed upon it by the hypnotist. Second, that it is the builder of the body, meaning it is the creative power within the individual. Its impersonality is evident in its capacity to assume any role suggested by the objective mind, suggesting that the manifestation of personality stems from association with the objective mind of one's own individuality. Whatever personality the objective mind impresses upon the subjective mind, the latter will adopt and act upon accordingly. Given that the subjective mind is the builder of the body, it will construct it in correspondence with the personality imprinted upon it. These two laws of the subjective mind form the foundation of the axiom that our body, our beliefs. If we firmly believe that the body is subject to influences beyond our control and that any symptom is a demonstration thereof, then this belief will be imprinted in the subjective mind, which will accept it unquestioningly and construct bodily conditions accordingly. Likewise, if we believe that certain material remedies are the sole form of healing, we will find in this belief the basis of all medicine. There is nothing false in medical theory. It is simply a logical correspondence with the level of knowledge that those who believe in it can assimilate, and it therefore operates precisely according to those beliefs. Therefore, for those who have not yet reached a higher inner perception of the law of nature, medical treatments are a valuable aid in relieving physical ailments. The error to combat is not the belief that medicine can be beneficial, but the belief that there is no better or higher way. Therefore, if we understand that the subjective mind is the one that constructs the body and is subject to no influence except those that pass through it, we must consider it as the source of perpetual life that continually renews the body with strong and healthy material, regardless of any other external influence, except for the desires that we impress upon our subjective mind through our own thoughts. When we internalize these ideas and put them into practice, our belief in our own power of life increases, necessarily leading to a healthier body and providing us with a solid foundation to support ourselves. Such is the purpose of mental science. Chapter 5. Further considerations regarding the subjective and objective mind. Intelligent reflection on the phenomenon of hypnotism will show us that what we call the hypnotic state is the normal state of the subjective mind. It always conceives itself in accordance with a suggestion that has convinced it both consciously and unconsciously of how the objective mind governs it and produces the corresponding result externally. The abnormal nature of the conditions induced by experimental hypnotism lies in the suppression of the normal control that the objective mind exercises over its subjective mind and its replacement with another control. It is of great importance to determine in each case what the nature of the suggestion is and what its source is. But before considering the sources of suggestion, we must more fully understand the place of the subjective mind in the natural order. If the student has followed what we have said about the presence of intelligent mind, filling all space and permeating all matter, he will have no difficulty recognizing in this universal mind, this total spirituality, the universal subjective mind. It is evident that the universal mind cannot have the characteristics of the objective mind. The universal mind is the creative power that pervades nature, and as the originating power, it must first give birth to the various forms in which the objective mind recognizes its individuality, before these individual minds can react within it. Thus, as pure mind or first cause, it can be nothing other than the subjective mind. The fact sufficiently proved by experiments that the subjective mind is the builder of the body shows that creative power through inner development is the essential characteristic of the subjective mind. Therefore, whether through experiments or a priori reasoning, we can assert that wherever we seek the creative power at work, we find the presence of the subjective mind, whether acting on a large scale in the cosmos or on a small scale in the individual. We can thus establish as a principle that the all-pervading universal intelligence, which we have considered in the second and third chapters, is purely the subjective mind. From this, we deduce the law of the subjective mind, which states that it is receptive to any suggestion and will follow any suggestion impressed upon it to its most rigorous logical consequences. The incalculable importance of this truth may not immediately strike the student, but a little reflection will reveal the enormous possibilities it contains. In the final chapter, I will make some brief considerations on the very serious conclusions that follow from it. For now, it will suffice to understand that the subjective mind within us is the same subjective mind that acts throughout the universe, giving birth to an infinity of natural forms that surround us and also within ourselves. It can be called the substrate of our individuality, and we can vaguely speak of our subjective mind as our personal part in the universal subjective mind. This obviously does not imply the division of the universal mind into fractions, and it is to avoid this error that in the third chapter I spoke of the essential unity of mind. But to address very abstract questions in the current state of the progress of students, it is practical to employ the idea of a personal part in the universal subjective mind. Understanding our individual subjective mind in this way will help us overcome the great metaphysical difficulty we encounter in our effort to make conscious use of the first cause, or in other words, to create external results through the power of our own thought. There is only one first cause, which is the universal mind, but being universal, it cannot act in the realm of the individual and the particular. To do so, it must cease to be universal, and thus cease to be the creative power we wish to employ. On the other hand, the fact that we are working with a defined objective implies our intention to use this universal power applied to a specific purpose, and thus we find ourselves involved in the paradoxical situation of wanting to make the universal act in the realm of the particular. We want to create a union between the two ends of the scale of nature, the most internal creative mind and a particular external form. Between them, there is a great space, and the question is, how to build a bridge. Here we have that the conception of our individual subjective mind as our individual part in the universal subjective mind provides the means to connect these ends, because on one side it is in immediate connection with the universal mind, and on the other it is in immediate connection with the objective individual or intellectual mind, and this is in immediate connection with the world of externalization that is conditioned by time and space. Thus, the relationship between the subjective and objective mind in the individual forms the necessary bridge to connect the two ends of the scale. The individual subjective mind can be seen as the organ of the absolute in the same way that the objective mind is the organ of the relative, and to make good use of these two organs, it is necessary to understand what the terms absolute and relative mean. The absolute is the idea of what is considered to exist by itself, and not in relation to anything else, that is, contemplating its essence, and the relative is the essence of what is contemplated in relation to other things, that is, circumscribed to a certain environment. The absolute is the realm of, and the relative is the realm of conditions. Therefore, if we want to control the conditions, this can only be done by our power of thought, operating in the realm of the absolute, which can only be done through the mediation of the subjective mind. The conscious use of the creative power of thought consists of acquiring the power to think in the absolute, and this can only be achieved through a clear conception of the interaction between our different mental functions. To do this, the student must consider that the subjective mind is extremely sensitive to suggestion, and as a creative power, it works precisely in the externalization of the suggestion that is deeply impressed upon it. Then, a good recognition of our mental constitution will allow us, with a defined and clear method, to remove any idea from the realm of the relative where it is limited and restricted by the conditions imposed by the circumstances surrounding it, and to transfer it to the absolute where it is not. The object of our desire must first be conceived by us in its exact relation to the existing circumstances, which may or may not seem favorable to it, and what we want to accomplish is to eliminate the elements of contingency and to realize something that is true in itself. To do this, we work in the realm of the absolute, and for this we must strive to impress upon our subjective mind the idea that we desire, completely detached from any condition. This separation of conditional elements implies the elimination of the idea of time, and therefore we must consider things as already existing. Unless we do this, we are not consciously operating in the realm of the absolute, and therefore we are not using the creative power of our thoughts. The simplest practical method to get into the habit of thinking in this way is to conceive of existence in the spiritual world of a spiritual prototype of every existing thing, which becomes the root of the corresponding external existence. If we get used to seeing the spiritual prototype as the essential being of the thing and the material form as the development of this prototype in its external expression, then we will see that the first step in the production of any external fact must be the creation of its spiritual prototype. This prototype, being purely spiritual, can only be formed by the operation of thought, and to have substance in the spiritual plane, it must be thought of as currently existing there. This conception was elaborated by Plato in his Doctrine of Archetypal Ideas and by Swedenborg in his Doctrine of Correspondences, and even a greater master long ago said, "Whatsoever things ye desire when ye pray, believe that ye receive them and ye shall have them." Mark 11:24. This is to emphasize the difference in verb tenses in this passage. The text first invites us to believe that our desire is already fulfilled, that it is already a done thing, and then its fulfillment will follow as something in the future. It is nothing more than a concise instruction for using the creative power of thought by impressing upon the universal subjective mind a particular thing that we desire as an already existing fact. By following this direction, we think in the realm of the absolute and eliminate from our mind any consideration of conditions, which implies limitations and the possibility of adverse contingencies. We plant a seed that, if left undisturbed, will inevitably germinate as an external fruit. To make intelligent use of our subjective mind, we create a nucleus which, once established, begins to exert an attractive force, drawing unto itself material of a similar character. And if this process is allowed to continue without disturbance, it will continue until an external form corresponding to the nature of the nucleus manifests in the objective and relative plane. This is the universal method of nature on every plane. Some of the most advanced thinkers in modern physical science, in their effort to elucidate the great mystery of the origin of the world, have postulated the formation of what they call annular vortices, formed by an extremely fine primordial substance. They tell us that this ring would be extremely small, would rotate in a pure, frictionless ether, would be indestructible and in perpetual motion. If two of these rings approach each other, and by the law of attraction join together, and this process continues with others, then matter as we perceive it with our external senses would thus be formed. Of course, no one has ever seen these rings with physical eyes. They are one of those abstractions that result if we follow the laws of physics and their mathematical sequences with their necessary consequences. We cannot consider things that we see without supposing the existence of other things that are not, and the theory of the vortex is one of those suppositions. This is not a theory of mental scientists, but it is the conclusion they have reached so far, and this conclusion is that all the countless forms of nature have their origin in the infinitely small nucleus of the annular vortex. But they do not wonder by what means the annular vortex received its initial impulse. Just as physicists have the theory of the vortex to consider the formation of the inorganic world, biology also has its own to consider the formation of living organisms. It also has its origin in a primary nucleus, which, once established, operates as a center of attraction for the formation of all those physical organs of which the perfect individual is composed. The science of embryology shows that these rules operate without exception throughout the animal kingdom, including man, and botany shows the same principle in the plant kingdom. All branches of physical science demonstrate the fact that every manifestation of any kind and on any scale begins with the establishment of an infinitely small nucleus, but endowed with an inexhaustible energy of attraction, causing a constant increase in power and definition of purpose, until the process of development is complete and the mature form emerges as an accomplished fact. Now, if this is the universal method of nature, there is nothing irrational in supposing that this operation could begin one step before the formation of the material nucleus. As soon as it is called to be, it begins to operate by the law of attraction on the material plane. But what is the force that originates the material nucleus? Recent work in physics has given us the answer in its deepest essence. Energy can only be understood by us as a manifestation of the direct operation of what we can call mind or will. The quote comes from a text entitled Waves in Water, Air and Ether, written in 1902 at the Royal Institution by John Ambrose Fleming. Here we have the testimony of physics that the origin of energy is mind or will. Therefore, we are not only making a logical deduction from certain undeniable intuitions of the human mind, but we are also following the line of the most advanced physical science when we say that the action of the nucleus in the mind, if it continues to develop without disturbance, will eventually attract all the necessary conditions for its manifestation in visible external form. The sole action of the mind is thought, and it is for this reason that through our thoughts we create the corresponding external conditions. We thus establish the nucleus that will attract to itself its own correspondences in their proper order, until the work accomplished manifests in the external plane. This is in accordance with the strictly scientific action of the universal law of development. We can therefore briefly summarize the entire argument by saying that when we focus our thought on something, we form a spiritual prototype of it, which constitutes a nucleus or a center of attraction for all the conditions necessary for its eventual externalization by the law of development inherent in the prototype itself. Chapter 6. The Law of Growth. The correct understanding of the law of development is of paramount importance to the student of mental science. What must be understood in relation to nature is that it is a universal principle independent of any artifice. We may attempt to circumvent the order of nature, but it will prevail in the end, returning, as the poet Horace said, through the back door. The beginning, middle, and end of the law of nature are the principle of the development of a vitality inherent to the entity itself. If we understand this from the outset, we will not employ our efforts unnecessarily trying to force things to be what they are not naturally. For this reason, when the Bible says that he who believes does not hasten, it is the statement of a great natural principle that indicates that success depends on our utilization and not on our opposition to the universal law of development. It is indisputable to us that the more vitality is put into the germ that we have agreed to call the spiritual prototype, the more quickly it will sprout. This is simply because with a greater conception, we put more developmental power into the seed than if we had a weakening conception. Ultimately, all our errors resolve themselves by trusting in the law of development. Whether we imagine in haste and anxiety that we can accelerate something to happen by some ineffective external method, or whether we lose hope and deny any germinative power to the seed that we have planted. The result is the same in both cases. We form a new spiritual prototype of a character opposed to our desires, which neutralizes the one formed previously, disintegrating to reproduce itself in an external circumstance. The only difference lies in the class of prototypes we form, and thus we attract the negative with the same law with which we attract the positive. These considerations will simplify our ideas about life. We do not need to consider two forces, but one alone as the cause of all things. The difference between good and its opposite simply results from the direction in which this force is set to flow. It is a universal law that if we reverse the action of a cause, we simultaneously reverse the effect. With the same apparatus, we can start a mechanical movement that will generate electricity or use electricity to generate mechanical movement. Or take a simple example of arithmetic. If 10 divided by 2 equals 5, then 10 divided by 5 equals 2. And therefore, if we recognize the power of thought to produce any result, we will see that the law by which negative thoughts produce negative results is the same as that by which positive thoughts produce positive results. Therefore, all our mistrust of the law of development, whether in the anxious effort to hurry something to happen or in allowing despair to take the place of joyful anticipation, reverses the action of the original cause and therefore the nature of the results. It is for this reason that the Bible, which is a book filled with profound wisdom, continually emphasizes the effectiveness of faith and the destructive influence of unbelief. Similarly, every book in every field of spiritual science strongly warns us against admitting doubt or fear. They are the inversion of the constructive principle, and therefore they pull downwards, but the law itself never changes, and it is in the immutability of the law that all mental science is founded. We are accustomed to understand the immutability of natural law in our daily lives, and therefore it should be easy to understand that the same immutability of law that we have on the visible side of nature, we also have on the invisible side. The variable factor is not the law, but our abolition, and it is by combining this variable factor with the invariable that we can produce the various desired results. The principle of development lies in the vitality inherent to the seed itself, and the operation of the gardener has its exact analogue in mental science. We do not put vitality, but we sow it, and we also moisten it, so to speak, with silent and concentrated contemplation of our desire as an already accomplished fact. But we must carefully remove from this contemplation any idea of vigorous effort on our part to make the seed grow. Its effectiveness lies in aiding to drive away those negative thoughts of doubt that will plant weeds in our wheat, and therefore instead of any effort, this contemplation must be accompanied by a feeling of pleasure and tranquility in foreseeing the realization of our desires. This is what asking of God in giving thanks, which St. Paul recommends. And this has its reason in the perfect totality of the law of being, which only needs our recognition to be used by us in whatever degree we desire. Some individuals possess the power of visualization, meaning they can create mental images of things to a higher degree than others, and through this faculty they can better utilize it to facilitate the work of the law. But those who do not possess this faculty at all should not be discouraged, as visualization is not the only way to allow the law to work on the invisible plane. Those whose mentality is inclined towards physical science should understand this law of growth as the creative force throughout all nature. And those with a mathematical mind can think that all solids are generated by the movement of a point, which, as our old friend Euclid tells us, has neither part nor magnitude, and is therefore a complete abstraction from what could be any spiritual nucleus. To use the words of the apostles, we deal with the substance of things unseen, and we must attain the mental capacity by which we will see this reality, and feel that we are mentally manipulating the only ultimate substance of which all visible things are but different modes. Therefore, we must view our mental creations as spiritual realities, then have confidence that the law of growth will do the rest. To clarify the foundations upon which practical work can be built, the student must strive to have a clear conception of what we mean by the intelligence of the undifferentiated initiating spirit. We want to take the idea of intelligence, and to separate it from the idea of individuality may be difficult until we become accustomed to it. The error in understanding this quality of the spirit is what has engendered all the theological errors that have brought bitterness into the world, and has been one of the main causes that have hindered the true development of humanity. To accurately communicate this conception in words may be impossible, and in attempting to define it, we limit it, which we precisely want to avoid. It's a matter of feeling more than definition. However, some effort should help us find the direction in which we should seek to feel this great truth. The idea is to understand personality, without that similarity that differentiates one individual from another. I am not that other because I am myself. This is the definition of individual likeness, which necessarily includes the idea of limitation, for the recognition of another individuality implies a point where our individuality ceases and the other begins. Therefore, this mode of recognition cannot be attributed to the universal mind, for it would indicate a point where it ceases and something else begins, which would be not recognizing it as universal, for the sense of universality includes all things and cannot recognize anything as being outside of it. We can say without a doubt that whatever the nature of this intelligence, it must be entirely devoid of the element of self-recognition as an individual personality on any scale. Viewed from this angle, it is clear that the original all-encompassing spirit is the great principle of personal life from which all particular manifestations of nature flow. It is impossible to overemphasize the point of its absolute impersonality in the sense of a total absence of consciousness of individual likeness. Ascribing individuality to the universal spirit is one of the two great errors we find in the foundations of religion and philosophy throughout all ages. The other is to go to the opposite extreme and deny the quality of personality in the universal spirit. The refutation of this error has remained since antiquity in these simple questions. He who made the eyes, shall he not see? He who built the ears, shall he not hear? Or as the popular saying goes, you cannot draw from the purse what is not in it. Therefore, the fact that we are centers of personal intelligence is proof that the infinite from which these centers are concentrated must be an infinite intelligence, and therefore we cannot deny to it the two factors which constitute personality, intelligence and will. We come to the conclusion that this diffused universal essence, which we can think of as a sort of universal protoplasm, must possess all the qualities of personality without that conscious self-recognition which constitutes separate individuality. Even the word personality is associated in our everyday language with the idea of individuality. Therefore, it might be preferable to create a new term and speak of the faculty of personalization of the universal mind to indicate its personal quality, separate from individuality. We must understand that this universal spirit permeates all space and all manifested substance, just as physicists tell us that the ether does, and wherever it is, it carries with it all that is in its own being. Therefore, we conclude that we are in the midst of an intelligent yet undifferentiated life, above, below, and around, passing through our minds as much as our bodies and all other beings. Gradually, as we grasp the truth of this assertion, our eyes begin to open to its immense significance. It means that all of nature is imbued with an infinite faculty of personalization in its potentiality of intelligence, sensibility, and power of expression, simply waiting to be called into activity by our recognition. It can only respond to us if we turn our attention towards it. If we are at that intellectual level where we see chance ruling the world, then this underlying universal thought will present itself to us simply as a fortuitous confluence of forces without any intelligible order, if we are advanced enough to see that this random confluence produces only chaos and not a cosmos. Then our conceptions expand towards the idea of a universal law, and we discover that it is the nature of the underlying all-principle. We have taken a great step from the plane of mere accident towards the world where there are definitive principles with which we can calculate with certainty when we know them. But here is the crucial point. The laws of the universe are there, but we are ignorant of them, and it is only through the experience gained from repeated errors that we become aware of the laws with which we must deal. Every step towards knowing the true law involves suffering resulting from our ignorant transgression, and given the infinite nature, we find ourselves faced with the paradoxical situation where we somehow seek to understand it with our individual intelligence. We must undertake a pilgrimage along a painful path under the lash of the inexorable law until we find the solution to the problem. But we wonder if we will be able to continue until we finally obtain possession of all knowledge. People do not understand what is meant by the infinite, or do not even pose the question. The infinite is limitless and inexhaustible. Imagine the greatest capacity you can and fill it with the infinite. What remains will be as infinite as what we had before. Mathematically, this is very clear. Raise x to any power you want, and yet the difference between the result and the original x, no matter how large, will always be immeasurable against the universal realm of law, which is the magnificent truth. This is one of the two great pillars of the universe, symbolized by the two pillars that support the entrance of Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz. However, Jachin must be balanced by Boaz. It is an enduring truth that can never be altered. Every transgression of the law of nature leads to punitive consequences. We cannot escape the realm of cause and its inevitable effect. There is no escape from the law of punishment except through knowledge. If we know the law of nature and work with it, we will find it as an unconditional friend, always ready to serve us and never blamed for past errors. But if we ignore it or transgress it, it will be our relentless enemy until we become obedient again, and thus the only redemption from perpetual pain and servitude will be through the self-expanding faculty inherent in divine life. The all-encompassing, which is both the law and the substance of all that is. The rabbis of antiquity said it well: the law, the Torah, is the mistress. When we understand that universal life and universal law are one with the universal faculty of personalization, then we establish the pillar Boaz as the necessary complement to Jachin, and when we find the common point of these two units, we will raise the royal arch through which we will enter triumphantly into the temple. We must dissociate the universal faculty of personalization from any concept of individuality. The universal can never be the individual. These are opposing terms. But because the universal faculty of personalization is the root of all individual personality, it seeks its highest expression in response to those who realize its personal nature. And it is this recognition that resolves the paradoxical appearance of the solution. The only way to achieve this knowledge of the infinite law that will transform the painful path into a path of happiness will be to include within ourselves a principle of knowledge corresponding to the infinity of what will be known. And this is accomplished by understanding that universal intelligence, within which we float like in a living ocean, is infinite like the law itself, an intelligence without individual personality, but which in producing us concentrates into the personal individualities that we are. What should be the relationship of this intelligence towards us? Not one of favoritism. There is nothing in the law that makes it favor one person over another. It is the root and support of each. It does not oppose our progress. Having no individuality, it has no personal objects in conflict with us. And as it is the origin of all individual intelligence, it cannot destroy the capacity to understand by the same conditions of its being. This underlying and all-producing infinity must be immediately responsive to anyone who realizes its true relationship with it. Being the principle of life itself, it must be infinitely sensitive to feelings, and therefore will reproduce with absolute accuracy any conception of self that we impress upon it. Therefore, if we intelligently understand that the innermost principle of being must, by reason of its universality, have a common nature with our own inner being, then we have resolved the paradoxical question of universal knowledge by realizing our identity of being with the universal spirit, which corresponds to the universal law. Thus, we arrive at the truth of St. John's statement, "You know all things." But this knowledge is primarily on the spiritual plane. It is not intellectual knowledge, for the universal spirit does not hold specific knowledge of particular facts, being an undifferentiated principle of knowledge that we can nevertheless differentiate in any direction we choose. It is a necessary philosophical conclusion to think that the action of individual spirit consists in differentiating the universal into particular applications according to the needs of the occasion. This constitutes the only limit we impose on manifesting in this sense. Thus, the recognition of the community of personality between us and the undifferentiated universal spirit, which is the root and substance of all things, resolves the question of freeing oneself from the inflexible law. It is not by the annulment of the law, which would mean the destruction of all things, but by the production within us of an intelligence equal in affinity with the universal law itself. This allows us to learn and respond to the requirements of the law in each particular case that arises. In this way, cosmic intelligence becomes individualized and individual intelligence becomes universalized. The two become one. And to the extent that this unity is understood and implemented, we will find that the law, which produces all external conditions of body and circumstances, will be understood more clearly and can be used more freely. With a firm and intelligent effort to develop ourselves along these lines, we can reach degrees of power to which it is impossible to assign limits. The seeker who wishes to understand the reason for the unfolding of his own possibilities must not make a mistake here. He must understand that the entire process consists of bringing the universal into the individual by raising the individual to the level of the universal, and not the other way around. This is to state a mathematical truism. You cannot contract the infinite, but you can extend the individual. And this is precisely the line of evolution's work. The law of nature cannot be altered in any degree, but understanding our own relationship with the universal principle of the underlying law allows us to use for our service all the particular laws, both on the visible and invisible side of nature, and thus achieve mastery of the situation. This is accomplished through knowledge, and the only knowledge that will accomplish this purpose in all its immeasurable immensity is the knowledge of the personal element in the universal mind and its reciprocity with our own personality. Our recognition of this mind must therefore be twofold, as a principle of necessity, sequence, order, or law, and also as a principle of intelligence responsive to our recognition. Chapter 8. Reciprocal action of the universal and individual mind. We must admit that in the previous speculations, we have reached the limits of theological speculation. However, the student must keep in mind that, as a mental scientist, it is his responsibility to consider the highest spiritual phenomenon as a purely scientific starting point for the work of the universal natural law. If he deals simply with the facts as he finds them, it is undeniable that the true meaning of many theological assertions will become clear to him. He would do well to establish as a general rule that it is not necessary, either for use or for understanding of any law, whether on the personal or impersonal side of nature, to give it a theological explanation. Although the inherent personal quality of the universal spiritual foundation, which is present in all things, must be recalled, we are dealing with a purely natural power that reappears at every point in a variety of forms, whether as person, animal, or thing. In each case, what comes back to the individual is directly related to his recognition of this power. When, through his individual development, he is unable to understand further, that is the limit of the relationship. But when the individual's power of recognition expands, he finds a reciprocal expansion from the intelligent power. Thus, he gradually develops an awareness of an intimate coherence between the individualized mind and its universal source. This is precisely the relationship that common scientific principles lead us to expect to find between the individual and the cosmic mind, assuming that the cosmic mind is the subjective mind and, for the reasons recently stated, we can see them in no other light than that of the subjective mind. It must exactly reproduce the conception that the objective mind of the individual has of itself, acting through his own subjective mind. At the same time, as a creative mind, it constructs external facts in correspondence with these conceptions. Each externalizes in his outer circumstances precisely his idea of the universal mind, and the man who understands that by the natural law of the mind, he can bring the universal mind into perfectly reciprocal action with himself, will make it a source of infinite instruction on the one hand and a source of infinite power on the other. He will judiciously alternate between the personal aspect and the impersonal aspect, between his individual mind and the universal mind, respectively. When seeking guidance or strength, he will regard his own mind as the impersonal element from which he will receive wisdom and strength. And when he wants to manifest what he has within, he must reverse the position and consider his own mind as the personal element and the universal mind as the impersonal element in which he can directly and assuredly impress his personal desires. There is no need to be alarmed at the magnitude of this conclusion. It necessarily follows from the natural relationship between subjective and objective mind. The only important question we need to ask ourselves is whether we will limit our vision to the level of the everyday, or whether we will extend it to enjoy the unlimited possibilities offered by the subjective mind. I want to delve into this subject deeply because it is the key to two important subjects, the law of supply and the nature of intuition. Often students find it easy to understand how the mind can influence the body with which it is intimately associated, but not how it can influence circumstances. If the operation of powerful thought were limited exclusively to the individual mind, this difficulty might arise. However, if there is one lesson that the student of mental science should have more than any other in his heart, it is that the action of powerful thought is not limited by the boundaries of individuality. What the individual does is to give direction to something unlimited, calling into action forces infinitely greater than himself, which, because they are themselves impersonal and intelligent thoughts, will receive the impression of his personality, and therefore can exert their influence beyond the limits that circumscribe the individual objective perception of the events he faces. This is why I strive to combine two apparent opposites in the universal mind, the union of intelligence with impersonality. Intelligence is capable not only of receiving the impression of our thoughts, but also of creating the correct means to achieve the goals. This is the only logical result of the assumption that we are dealing with infinite intelligence, which is also infinite life. Life means power, and infinite life therefore means unlimited power. And unlimited power, animated by unlimited intelligence, cannot be conceived of as stopping short of reaching its goal. Thus, once intention is formulated in the part of the universal mind, there is no doubt about what its final result will be. So the question of intention arises. How can we know what the intention of the universal mind might be? This is where the element of impersonality comes into play. It has no intention because it is personal, as I have said. The universal mind operates according to the law of the mean-term averages for the advancement of the species, and it does not care about the particular desires of the individual. If his desires are in line with the general progressive movement of the eternal principle, nothing in nature, no power, will prevent them from being fully realized. If they oppose the general progressive movement, then they will collide with it and be crushed. From this relationship, it follows that the same principle that appears in the individual mind as will becomes in the universal mind the law of the tendency and direction of that tendency, always pointing towards the gift of life. Therefore, in every case, the proof lies in whether our particular intention is going in the same direction as life. And if it is, then we can be absolutely sure that there is no intention in the universal mind to counteract the intention of our individual mind. We are dealing with a purely impersonal force that will not oppose us, just as neither steam nor electricity would. By thus combining these two aspects of the universal mind, which is totally impersonal and a perfect intelligence, we find the type of natural force we were looking for, something that will undertake whatever we put into its hands without asking questions or negotiating terms. By thus favoring our affairs, it will bring to fruition an intelligence for which all the united knowledge of humanity is nothing, and a power equal to its intelligence. The purpose of all that has been said is to familiarize the student with the nature of the power he can employ and how to use it. In summary, I can say that your goal, student, is not to create an entire cosmos, but to trace particular physical, mental, moral, or financial benefits in your life or that of another. From this individual point of view, the universal creative power has no mind in itself, and therefore you can serve as its mind. When this is done, the universal creative power listens to you and organizes the work to achieve the goals on which it has been focused. Unless this concentration is dissipated by the same agent that produced it, You will work for the law of growth until complete manifestation on the external plane. In dealing with this great impersonal intelligence, we are dealing with the infinite. We must understand the infinite as touching all points of space and time. Therefore, there is no difficulty in understanding that this intelligence can reconcile the necessary means to achieve its goal. Understanding the law in relation to the result that will occur should prompt us to set aside any questions about the specific means that will be used in each case. Questioning this is sowing a seed of doubt, which is our first objective to eliminate. Our intellectual effort must therefore be directed not towards attempting to predict the various secondary causes that will eventually combine to produce the desired result, assuming in advance which particular causes will be necessary and where they will have to come from. But we must direct our intellectual effort to understand more clearly the rationality of the general law that sets in motion the series of secondary causes. The intellectual, by questioning it, becomes the greatest obstacle to our success and only increases our doubts by trying to grasp the details that are completely beyond its reach at that time. But used otherwise, it produces considerable material aid in maintaining that nucleus without which there is no center from which the principle of growth can assert itself. The intellect can only deduce consequences from the facts it is capable of formulating, and therefore cannot deduce any conviction from facts it cannot yet become aware of through external senses. But for the same reason, it can understand the existence of a law by which as yet unmanifested circumstances can be brought into manifestation. Thus used, the intellect becomes the servant of that great inner power within us, which leads to the invisible substance of all things, and which we can call the first relative cause. Chapter 9. Causes and Conditions. The term first relative cause was used in the last chapter to distinguish the action of the creative principle in the individual mind, on the one hand, from the universal first cause, and on the other hand, from secondary causes, as they exist within us. The first cause is the power that initiates a set of causes directed towards an individual goal. It is the first cause, the power to initiate a new sequence of cause and effect relative to an individual goal. Therefore, we can speak of a first relative cause, or in other words, the power of the first cause manifested in the individual. Understanding and using this power is the whole object of mental science, and it is therefore necessary for the student to see clearly the relationship between causes and conditions. A simple illustration will be better for this purpose than any detailed explanation. If a lit candle is placed in a room, it is illuminated, and if it is removed, it becomes dark again. Both illumination and darkness are conditions, one positive resulting from the presence of light, and the other negative resulting from its absence. From this simple example, we see that each positive condition has a corresponding opposite negative condition, and this correspondence is the result of both being related to the same cause, one positively and the other negatively. We can therefore deduce the rule that any positive condition results from the active presence of a certain cause, and any negative condition from the absence of that cause. A condition, whether positive or negative, is never a first cause, and the first cause can never be negative, because negation is the condition resulting from the absence of the active cause. This should be carefully understood as the philosophical basis of all rejections and denials that play an important role in mental science, to which can be added the assertion that evil is the negation or deprivation of good, and that it has no substantive existence in itself. However, conditions, whether positive or negative, are not called into existence until they become causes in their time and produce other conditions, and so on infinitely, giving rise to the entire succession of secondary causes. If we judge solely by the information communicated by our external senses, we are working on the plane of secondary causes and see only a succession of conditions as part of an endless set of conditions arising from the past and heading towards the future. From this point of view, we are under the inexorable rule of destiny, from which there is no possibility of escape, as external senses can only deal with relationships where one mode of limitation produces another, as these are the instruments by which we become aware of the relative and the conditioned. The only way to escape is to move out of the region of secondary causes into that of first causes, where the original energy lies before even being passed into manifestation as a condition. This region is found within ourselves. It is the region of pure ideas, and that is why I am interested in both aspects of the mind, as pure thought and as manifested form. The thought image or ideal pattern of an object is the first relative cause of that object. It is the substance of that object, not preceded by any previous condition. If we understand that every visible object must have its origin in the mind, then all creation around us is evidence that the starting point of all things is in thought images or ideas, because no other action than the formation of these images can be conceived by the mind before its manifestation in matter. If this is the modus operandi of the mind for its self-expression, we only have to transfer this conception from the scale of the cosmic mind operating on the universal plane to the individualized mind operating on the particular plane, to see that the formation of an ideal image through our thought sets the first cause in motion towards that specific goal. There is no difference in nature between the operation of the first cause in the universal and in the particular. The difference is only one of scale, but the power itself is identical. Therefore, we must always keep clearly in mind whether we are consciously using the first cause or not. I emphasize the word consciously because, whether we are aware of it or not, we are always using the first cause. That is why I insist that the universal mind is purely subjective and therefore limited by the laws that apply to subjective mind at any scale. We always impress upon it some sort of idea, whether consciously or not, and all our existing limitations result from habitually impressing upon it this idea of limitation by confining all possibility to the region of secondary causes. However, research shows us that conditions are never causes in themselves, but are the later link in a chain begun on the plane of pure ideal. We must reverse our method of thinking and see the ideal as the real and the external manifestation, as the mere reflection that changes with every change of the object that shapes it. For this reason, it is essential to know whether we are consciously using the first cause for defined purposes or not. If we consider that the achievement of our goal depends on past, present, or future circumstances, we are not consciously using the first cause. We descend to the level of secondary causes, which is the region of doubt, fear, and limitations, which we impress upon the universal subjective mind with the inevitable result that it will build corresponding external conditions. But if we understand that the region of secondary causes is the region of mere reflections, we will not think of our goal as contingent upon any condition, but we will know that by forming the idea of it absolutely and maintaining that idea, we will have established the first cause in the form of it and can await the result with joyful expectancy. This is where the importance of understanding the independence of the mind from space and time is crucial. An ideal cannot be formed in the future. It must be formed here and now, or it will never be formed. And that is why every teacher who has spoken on this subject has suggested to their disciples the necessity of seeing themselves with their desires already fulfilled on the spiritual plane as an indispensable condition for realization in the visible and the concrete. When this is correctly understood, it is entirely useless to resort to a state of anxiety to achieve our goals, for if the result is already assured, it follows that the steps leading to it are also assured. Resources will pass through the small circle of our daily conscious activity in their natural order, and we will work on them not with fear, doubt, or feverish excitement, but with calm and joy, knowing that the result is assured. Our reasonable use of these resources naturally present in the desired direction is only part of a larger coordinated movement, of which we have no doubt about the final result. Mental science does not reward laziness, but removes work from the region of anxiety and effort by guaranteeing the worker the success of his labor, even if it is not in the precise form anticipated, but in another better suited to his needs. However, suppose that when we reach a point where a decision must be made, assuming the result is already assured, you cannot make a wrong decision. Your correct decision is one of the many necessary steps to achieve the result, just like all the other conditions leading to it. Thus, even being careful to avoid an action, we can be sure that the same law guiding other circumstances in the right direction will also influence our judgments to achieve good results. We must understand exactly our relationship with the great impersonal power that we are using. It is intelligent, we are intelligent, and both intelligences must cooperate. We should not expect the law to do for us what it can only do through us. Therefore, we must use our intelligence knowing that it acts as the instrument of a greater intelligence. And because we have this knowledge, we can and must put an end to all anxiety for the final result. In practice, we must first form the ideal conception of our object with the definite intention of impressing it upon the universal mind. It is this intention that elevates this thought from mere causal imagination and asserts that our knowledge of the law is sufficient reason to calmly await a corresponding result. Thus, all necessary conditions will come to us in their natural order. Therefore, we can carry on our daily affairs with the quiet conviction that the initial conditions are already there or will soon come into view. If we ever do not see them, let us remain calm, knowing that the spiritual prototype already exists and awaits for a circumstance pointing in the desired direction to begin to manifest. It may be a very small circumstance, but it is the direction, not the magnitude, that we take into consideration. As soon as we see it, we should regard it as the first sprout of the seed we have planted in the Absolute, and with calm and without excitement, do what the circumstances seem to require. Then we will see that what we do will guide us to other circumstances in the same direction until we find ourselves step by step towards the fulfillment of our goal. Thus, by understanding the great principle of the law of supply, we will completely free ourselves from the region of anxious thought and laborious work. This knowledge will lead us to a new world where the habitual use of all our powers, whether mental or physical, will be only an expression of our individuality in the lines of its own nature, and therefore a perpetual source of health and joy. This is sufficient incentive for the careful study of the laws governing the relationship between individual and universal mind. Chapter 10. Intuition. We have seen that the subjective mind responds to the suggestion of the objective mind, but there is also an action of the subjective mind on the objective mind. The individual subjective mind is the deepest self, and its main role is to maintain the individuality upon which it is founded. As pure mind, it continually exists on the plane where all things subsist in the universal, here and now and infinitely. Therefore, it can inform the lower mind of things distant from its view, both in distance and in time, for the absence of the conditions of time and space must logically concentrate all things into an ever-present focal point. We cannot limit the perceptive power of the subjective mind, and so the question arises as to why the subjective mind does not continuously keep the objective mind informed on all points. The answer is that it would if the objective mind were sufficiently trained to recognize the indications given, and accomplishing this training is one of the objectives of mental science. Once we recognize the position of the subjective mind as the support of complete individuality, we cannot doubt that much of what we take as spontaneous movement of the objective mind has its origin in the subjective mind, pushing the objective mind in the right direction without our conscious being realizing it. But sometimes, when the urgency of the situation demands it, or for a reason still unknown, the objective mind is temporarily in closer rapport with the subjective mind, and the inner voice is heard with strength and persistence. When this happens, we are right to pay attention to it. Limited space prevents me from giving examples, but such experiences will certainly not be unfamiliar to the reader. The importance of understanding and following intuition cannot be overstated, but I sincerely admit the great practical difficulty of finding the right balance between neglecting the inner voice and being carried away by unfounded imaginations. The best guidance is knowledge that comes from personal experience, gradually leading to the acquisition of a kind of internal sense of touch that allows us to distinguish the true from the false, and seems to grow with the sincere desire for truth and the recognition of the mind as its source. The only general principles that the writer can deduce from his own experience are that, despite all appearances pointing in the direction of certain behavior, if the feeling persists that it should not be followed, in most cases it will be found that the argument of the objective mind, as objectively correct as the known facts may be, is limited, because there is an ignorance of facts that could not be objectively known at that time, but are known by the intuitive faculty. Another principle is that the feeling of our first impression on any subject is generally correct. Before the objective mind begins to argue on a subject, it is like the surface of a calm lake, where the light coming from above is clearly reflected. But as soon as it starts to argue on external appearances, the waters begin to stir, and the original image becomes blurred and no longer recognizable. The first conception is quickly lost. Therefore, it is advisable to observe carefully and discerningly the various arguments that will subsequently arise on the objective plane. However, it is impossible to reduce an inner action like intuition to rigid and sure rules. Beyond carefully noting the particular cases that occur, probably the best plan for the student will be to include the whole subject of intuition in the principle of the law of attraction, especially if he sees how this law interacts with that personal quality of the universal mind, which we have already discussed. Chapter 11. Healing. The subject of healing has been widely treated by many authors, and all deserve all the attention that is given to them. However, the aim of these readings is rather to strengthen the student in those general principles on which all conscious use of the creative power of thought rests, rather than to delve into formal rules for specific application. Therefore, I will examine the principles that seem to be common to various methods of mental healing currently in use, and which derive their effectiveness not from the particularity of the method, but from how they allow the higher laws of nature to come into play. The universal principle for all mental healers, in one formulation or another, is that the basis of all healing is a change in belief. This follows from the following sequence. A. The subjective mind is the creative faculty within us and creates what the objective mind impresses upon it. B. The objective mind or intellect impresses its thoughts upon it. C. Thought is the expression of belief. Therefore, what the subjective mind creates is the external reproduction of our beliefs. Thus, our general aim is to change our beliefs, and we cannot do so without a strong conviction of the falseness of our old beliefs and the truth of the new ones. We find these reasons in the law of causality that I have tried to explain. The false belief that externalizes itself in the form of disease is the belief that some secondary cause, which is only a condition, is a cause. Knowledge of the law shows that there is only one primary cause, and that is the factor that in our individuality we call the subjective or subconscious mind. For this reason, I have insisted on the difference between placing an idea in the subconscious mind, that is, on the plane of the absolute and without reference to time and space, and placing the same idea in the conscious intellectual mind, which perceives only things related to time and space. Thus, the only conception you can have of yourself in the absolute or the unconditioned is that you are a pure living spirit, unimpeded by any conditions and therefore not subject to disease. And when this idea is firmly impressed upon the subconscious mind, it will externalize. The reason why this process is not always successful on the first attempt is that all our lives we have held the false belief that disease is a substantial entity in itself and a primary cause, instead of simply a negative condition resulting from the absence of the primary cause, and a deeply rooted belief from childhood cannot be eradicated quickly. Often after treatment we see an improvement in the patient's health, and after some time the old symptoms return. This is because the new belief with its own creative faculty has not yet had time to penetrate deeply into the subconscious mind, but has only done so partially. Each successive treatment strengthens the subconscious mind to support the new belief a little more, until finally permanent healing is achieved. This is the method of self-treatment based on the patient's knowledge of the law of his being. However, this is not the case for all men. Perhaps the knowledge is there, but to such a degree of recognition that it does not qualify him for self-treatment with success. In this case, the intervention of the healer becomes necessary. The only difference between the healer and the patient is that the former has learned how to control the less self-aware modes of the mind by the most self-aware mode. Even if the patient has not yet acquired the knowledge, what the healer does is to replace the patient's objective or conscious mentality, which is the will working with the intellect, with his own, and thus find an entry into the patient's subconscious mind and imprint there the suggestion of perfect health. A question then arises: how can the healer's consciousness replace that of the patient? The answer lies in the practical application of the abstract principles that I have dealt with in the preceding chapters. Our usual conception of ourselves is that individual personality ends where another personality begins. In other words, the two personalities are entirely separate. This is a mistake. There is no rigid line of demarcation between personalities, and the boundaries between them may be more or less clear depending on the will. In fact, they can be completely suppressed temporarily, and the two personalities can merge into one. The action that takes place between the healer and the patient depends on this principle. The healer asks the patient to put himself in a receptive mental attitude, which means that he exerts his will with the aim of lifting the barriers of his own objective personality. Thus, the mental power of the healer can enter. On his part, the healer does the same, but with the difference that while the patient removes the barrier from his side in order to admit the flow, the healer does so with the intention of transmitting the fluid. Thus, by the joint work of the two minds, the barriers of both personalities are lifted, and the direction of the abolition flow is thus determined. It is like saying that the flow comes from the healer, who is actively ready to give, to the patient, who is in a passive attitude and ready to receive, in accordance with the universal law of nature, whereby the flow must always go from full to void. This mutual suppression of the external mental barrier between the healer and the patient is what is called establishing rapport between them. Here we find one of the most valuable practical applications of the principle explained earlier in this book, namely that the pure mind is present simultaneously in its entirety at every point. Therefore, as soon as the healer understands that the barriers of the external personality between him and his patient have been lifted, he can then speak to the patient's subconscious mind as if it were his own thought, both being pure minds. The thought of identity makes them identical, and both are concentrated into a single entity at a single point, where the conscious mind of the healer can function in accordance with the universal principle of controlling the subconscious mind through suggestion. If we concentrate our mind on the patient's state of illness, think of him as a divided personality, and do not focus our mind on the conception of him as a pure mind. This will offer us an effective entry to his source of being. We must withdraw our thoughts from the contemplation of symptoms and, in fact, from his whole bodily personality. We must regard him as a purely spiritual individuality, entirely free from any condition, and voluntarily externalize the conditions that express the vitality and intelligence that the pure mind is thinking in this way. We mentally affirm that he will outwardly build what corresponds to that perfect vitality that he inwardly knows in himself, and this suggestion will be impressed by the conscious thought of the healer, while the conscious thought of the patient will simultaneously focus on the fact that he is receiving the active thought of the healer. As a result, the subconscious mind of the patient is completely inspired by the recognition of his own power to give life, and in accordance with the recognized law of the subconscious mentality, this suggestion will pass to work in external manifestation. Thus, illness will be replaced by health. It should be understood that the purpose of the process described here is to strengthen the individuality of the subject, not to dominate him. To use it for domination would be an inversion, bringing to the operator the appropriate pain. In this description, I have envisaged the case where the patient cooperates consciously with the healer, and it is to obtain this cooperation that the mental healer generally gives precise instruction to the patient on the principles of mental science, if he is not informed of them. However, this is not always advisable or possible. Sometimes the exposition of principles clashes with existing prejudices, arousing opposition. Any active antagonism on the part of the patient tends to intensify the barrier of conscious personality, which is the first object to be removed by the healer. In these cases, nothing is as effective as distant treatment. If the student has understood all that has been said on the subject of mind and matter, he will have seen that in mental treatment, time and space are of no importance, as the complete action takes place on a plane where these conditions do not obtain. Therefore, it is immaterial whether the patient is in immediate presence of the healer or in a distant country. Under these circumstances, we find by experience that one of the most effective methods of mental healing is treatment during sleep. For at that time, the patient's total system is naturally in a state of relaxation, thereby preventing him from consciously opposing the treatment. Similarly, the healer is also able to treat more effectively during his own sleep than when he is awake. Before going to sleep, he firmly impresses upon his subconscious mind to transmit a healing suggestion to the patient's subconscious mind. Thus, according to the general principle of the relationship between subjective and objective mind, this suggestion will be transmitted during all hours when individual consciousness is at rest. This method is applicable to children to whom the principles of science cannot be explained, and also to persons at a distance. Truly, the only advantage gained by the personal meeting of patient and healer lies in the instruction that might be given verbally, or when the patient is in an early stage of knowledge where he needs the healer's visible presence to communicate to him the suggestion that something is being given to him, which could not be done in his absence. Otherwise, the presence or absence of the patient is a perfectly indifferent matter. The student should always remember that the subconscious mind does not function through the intellect or the conscious mind to produce its healing effects. It is part of the total creative force of nature. The intellect does not create but distributes. Mental healing is one step away from telepathy, clairvoyance, and other similar manifestations of transcendental power, which are sometimes exhibited by the subjective entity and which follow laws as precise as those that govern what we consider our more normal faculties. However, these subjects are not within the scope of a book whose purpose is to show the principles underlying all spiritual phenomena. Until these are clearly understood, the student will not be able to benefit from the detailed study of the most intimate powers. Doing this without a solid foundation in knowledge and some experience in its practical application exposes one to unknown dangers and goes against the principle that advancement into the unknown can only be made from the starting point of knowledge. Otherwise, we simply enter a region of confusion, pseudo-work, with no defined principle to guide us. Chapter 12. Will is of such importance that the student should beware of any error in the position he takes in mental economy. Many writers and teachers emphasize the power of the will as the place where the creative faculty resides. There is no doubt that intense willpower can produce certain external results, but like all compulsive methods, they lack the permanence of natural growth. The forms and conditions produced by the sheer intensity of willpower will only persist as long as the force that compels them persists. However, once exhausted or withdrawn, the elements thus forced into an artificial combination will return to their natural affinities. Forms created by compulsion never have in themselves the germ of vitality and are thus dissipated as soon as the external energy supporting them is withdrawn. The error lies in attributing creative power to the will, or perhaps I should say attributing creative power to ourselves. The truth is that man never creates anything. His function is not to create, but to combine and distribute what already exists. What we call our creations are new combinations of existing material, whether mental or bodily. This is widely demonstrated in the physical sciences. No one speaks of creating energy, but only of transforming one form of energy into another. And if we understand this as a universal principle, we will see that both in the mental and physical realms, we never create energy, but simply provide the conditions by which existing energy in one form can manifest in another. Therefore, relative to man, what we call his creative power is that receptive attitude of expectancy, which amounts to saying to create a mold into which plastic and even undifferentiated substance can flow and take the desired form. Will is in the same place in our mental machinery as the lathe operator is to the lathe. It is not the power, but it keeps the mental faculties in a relative position with the power that enables it to accomplish the desired work. If we use words in their broad sense, we can say that imagination is the creative function and will the centralizing principle. Its function is to keep the imagination centered in the right direction. We try to consciously control our mental powers instead of letting them go aimlessly, and to produce external results, we must understand the relationship these powers have with each other. The sequence begins with an emotion that generates a desire. Then judgment determines whether it should be externalized or not. When desire is approved by judgment, will takes over and directs the imagination to form the necessary spiritual prototype. The imagination, thus focused on a particular object, will create the spiritual core that will act as a center around which the forces of attraction will begin to work and continue to operate until, by the law of growth, the concrete result becomes perceptible to our external senses. The work of the will is then to keep the different faculties of our mind in a position where they actually accomplish the desired work. This position can be generalized into the following three attitudes. Either we want to act on something, or we want to be guided by something, or we maintain a neutral position towards another thing. In other words, we try to project a force, receive a force, or maintain a position of relative inactivity towards a particular object. Judgment determines which of these three positions we will take: active awareness, receptive awareness, or neutral awareness. Then the function of the will is simply to maintain the position we have determined. If we maintain this mental attitude, we can be sure that the law of action will bring us the corresponding facts that symbolize externally the attitude in question. This is very different from the semi-animal writhing of nervous forces with which some people use the power of will. Our attitude, on the other hand, does not involve tensing the nervous system, and therefore no fatigue ensues. The power of will, when transferred from the region of lower mentality to the spiritual plane, simply becomes a calm and peaceful determination to maintain a certain mental attitude despite all temptations to the contrary, knowing that it will certainly produce the desired result. Training the will and shifting it from a lower to a higher plane of our nature are among the first objectives of mental science. Man sums himself up in his will. What he does with his will is his own act. What he does without the consent of his will is not his own act, but that of the power that compels him. But we must recognize that, at the mental level, no other will can gain control over ours unless we allow it first. That is why any legitimate use of mental science strengthens the will, both in ourselves and in others, and places it under the control of an enlightened reason. When the will understands its power to deal with the prime cause, it is not necessary for the operator to formulate the whole philosophy of his action every time he wants to use it. But knowing that trained will is a mighty spiritual force acting on the plane of the prime cause, he will simply express his desire with the intention of operating on that plane, remembering that desire expressed by will eventually manifest as a concrete fact. Now he sees that the point that really demands his sincere attention is not whether he possesses the power to externalize any result he chooses, but rather to learn to wisely choose what result to produce. But let us not suppose that even the highest powers will exempt us from the law of cause and effect. We can never set a cause in motion without producing the effects it already contains in embryo, and which will in turn become causes in producing a series that will continue to flow until it is stopped by the operation of a cause of opposite character. In this way, we will find the field of exercise of our intelligence continually expanding with the expansion of our powers to dispense a good intention. We will always want to consider the result of our action as far as our intelligence allows us. We may not be able to see very far, but we can gain confidence with a general principle drawn from what has already been said about causes and conditions, namely that the total sequence always shares the same character of the initial cause. If the character is negative, i.e., devoid of any desire to externalize good, joy, strength, beauty, or any other form of good, this negative quality will be felt throughout the downward line. But if its opposite, the affirmative character, is in the initial motive, it will reproduce all kinds of forms of love, joy, strength, and beauty with unerring precision. So before we set about creating new conditions by exercising our power of thought, we should carefully weigh what types of results we aspire to. And here again, we will find a vast field for the training of our will. Learning to acquire self-control that allows us to defer immediate lower satisfaction for a grand future, good naturally leads us to the subject of concentration. The word concentrate means to gather at the center, and the center of something is that point where all forces are equally balanced. Concentrating, therefore, first means putting our minds in a condition of equilibrium that will allow us to consciously direct the flow of the mind toward a defined and recognized goal. Then we will ensure to induce our thoughts to flow in an opposite direction. We must always bear in mind that we are dealing with a wonderful potential energy that is not yet differentiated in any way, and that through the action of our mind, we can differentiate it specifically according to our will. By keeping our thoughts fixed on the fact that the influx of this energy is occurring, and that through our mental attitude we have gradually directed its direction, we will realize a corresponding externalization. Concentration, therefore, does not consist of extreme efforts that exhaust the nervous system and contradict its own purpose by suggesting awareness of an adverse force that is fighting it, thus creating the adverse circumstances we fear. Rather, it consists of excluding all types of thoughts that could scatter the spiritual core we are forming and residing joyfully in the knowledge that because the law is sure in its action, our desire will certainly be fulfilled. The other great principle to remember is that concentration aims to determine the quality we will give to undifferentiated energy rather than fixating on the specific circumstances of its manifestation. It is the work of the creative energy itself, which, if we allow it, will build with quiet naturalness according to its own form of expression, thus saving us much unnecessary anxiety. What we truly want is expansion in a certain direction, whether it be health or wealth, and when we obtain it, it does not matter whether we obtained it through a channel we thought we could count on or through another whose existence we did not suspect. The fact is that we are concentrating the energy of a class for a particular purpose that we must fix in our minds and not see any specific detail as essential to the achievement of our goal. These are the two golden rules of concentration, but let us not think that because we are guarding against unnecessary drifting, there is no rest. On the contrary, during periods of rest, we accumulate strength for action. Rest does not mean a purposeless state, for as pure spirit, the subjective mind never rests. It is only the objective mind, in connection with the physical body, that rests, and although the greatest rest possible is certainly obtained by completely stopping the action of our conscious thought, generally the most available method is to change the direction of thoughts. Instead of centering them on something we are trying to do, we let them quietly dwell on what we are. It is not always necessary for us to consciously project our forces to produce an external effect or to work on the details of a metaphysical problem. We can simply understand ourselves as part of universal life and thus gain peaceful centralization. Although maintained by a conscious act of will, it is in its deepest essence a rest. From this standpoint, we see that everything is life and everything is good. Nature, from its clearly visible surface to its deepest mysteries, is a great source of life and good, both entirely devoted to our individual use. We have the key to all its treasures and can apply our knowledge of the law of being without entering into all those details necessary for study. By applying them, we will result in the acquisition of the consciousness of our unity with the whole. This is the great secret, and by delving into it, we can enjoy our possession of all or part of it, for by our recognition, we have made it and can increasingly make it ours. Whatever attracts us most at a particular time or place is the mode of the universal living mind with which we are most in contact at that moment. By understanding this, we draw from it a stream of vital energy that produces in us a sense of joy of living that radiates from us like a sphere of vibration capable of deflecting any harmful suggestion from any plane. We may not have the literary, artistic, or scientific skill to present to others the result of our communion with nature, but the joy of this feeling produces a corresponding result that manifests in a happier look and a kinder face of one who thus understands his unity with every aspect of the whole. He understands that, and this is the great point, In this attitude of the mind that is directed towards no specific external object but towards itself, he is and will always be the center of all that galaxy of life. He then contemplates himself as seated at the center of infinitude, not an infinity of empty space, but pulsating with living being, recognizing in everything that the true essence is only good. This is the opposite of selfish self-centeredness. It is the very center where we receive all, and from where it flows to all. Outside of this principle, there is no true life. And if we contemplate our central position as an advantage solely for taking, we have biased our perspective by losing the true nature of the principle of life, which is action and reaction. If life enters us, we must engage in life, enter into its spirit, as we would enter into the spirit of a book or a game to enjoy it. There is no action at the center. There must simply be a perpetual flow out to the circumference and back to the center to maintain vital activity. Otherwise, there is a collapse both by anemia and congestion. But if we understand the reciprocal nature of vital pulsation, and that outward flow consists in the habit of the mind of giving to others the good it sees in itself, then we will discover that cultivating this disposition will provide countless avenues for universal life to flow through us, both in giving and receiving, as we had never suspected before. And this action and reaction will build our own vitality in such a way that every day we will find ourselves more alive than before. Thus, it is the attitude of rest in which we can appreciate all the beauties of science, literature, and art, or we can communicate serenely with the spirit of nature without the aid of another person acting as interpreter. This attitude has a purpose, even if it is not directed towards a specific object. We have not allowed the will to lose its control. We have simply changed its direction, both for action and for rest. We find that our strength lies in the recognition of the unity of the mind and ourselves as individual concentrations of it. Chapter 13. In Contact with the Subconscious Mind. In the preceding pages, the student will have understood the immense importance of our relationship with the subconscious mind. Our relationship with it, both on an individual and universal scale, is the key to all that we are or can be. In its unrecognized work lies the source of all that we can call the automatic action of mind and body. On a universal scale, it is the silent power of evolution working progressively forward in this divine event that animates all creation. The greater our relationship with what we have so far considered automatic action, the more it will be under our control, both in our body and in our circumstances, until we ultimately control our entire individual world. For as it is a formidable subject, the question of how we practically come into contact with the subconscious mind becomes important. The clue that gives us the right direction is to find the impersonal quality of the subconscious mind that I have spoken of. Not impersonal, as lacking elements of personality, nor even in the case of the individual subjective mind, as lacking a sense of individuality, but impersonal in the sense of not recognizing the particular external relationships that appear to the objective mind as constitutive of its personality, and having a self-awareness independent of it. So if we want to come into contact with it, we must come together in its own domain. It can only view things from the deductive standpoint, and therefore cannot take note of the inductive standpoint from which we construct the idea of our external personality. Thus, if we want to come into contact, we will not do so by bringing it down to the level of the external and non-essential, but only by elevating it from the internal and essential. But how can this be done? Let two well-known writers answer. Rudyard Kipling tells us in his story, Kim, how the boy sometimes uses to lose his sense of personality the repetition of the question, "Who is Kim?" Gradually his personality fades, and he experiences a feeling of passing into a sublime and vast life, in which the boy Kim was unknown, although his own consciousness of individuality remained exalted and expanded in inconceivable amplitude. And from Tennyson we know through his son that sometimes the poet had a similar experience. We come into contact with the absolute exactly in proportion to the extent to which we withdraw from the relative. They vary inversely with each other. For the purpose of coming into contact with our subconscious mind, we must try to consider ourselves as a pure being, as that inner entity which underlies external manifestation. And in doing so, we will understand that the essential quality of the pure being must be good. It is in itself a pure life, and as such it cannot wish anything harmful to the pure life that manifests in any form. Consequently, the purest intentions will take place within ourselves in relation to our subjective entity, and a fortiori will apply to that which is more deeply subconscious, of which our individual subjective mind is a particular manifestation. In practice, the process consists first in forming a clear conception in the objective mind of the idea we want to convey to the subjective mind. Then, when it has been firmly affirmed, we try to divert attention from all other facts related to external personality, except the one in question. Then we address the subjective mind as if it were an independent entity and impress upon it what one wants to believe or do. Everyone should formulate their own method of work, but a method that is both simple and effective is to say to the subjective mind, "This is what I want you to do. You will come where I am, and you will do it by bringing all your power and intelligence to realize it. There is nothing in me that I regard as you regard me." Having done this, we return to the understanding of objective personality and let the subjective consciousness do its work with confidence, for, according to the law of its nature, it will do so, if we do not disturb it, with the repetition of contradictory messages from the objective mind. This is not mere fancy, but a truth daily proved by an increasing number of experiences. The facts have not been made to fit the theory, but the theory has been built by the careful observation of facts. And since the law of the relationship between the subjective and objective mind has been demonstrated by theory and practice, we are faced with a very important question. Is there any reason why the law that works correctly for the individual subjective mind should not also work correctly for the universal mind? The answer is no, as we have shown. The universal mind must, by virtue of its universality, be purely subjective, and what is law for the part is also law for the whole. The qualities of fire are the same, whether it be large or small in combustion. Thus we can conclude this lecture by considering the results we will obtain if we apply what we have learned from the individual subjective mind to the universal mind. We have learned three great truths in studying the subjective mind: its creative power, its response to suggestion, and its inability to function other than by deductive method. This last point is very important because it implies that the action of the subjective mind is in no way limited by the past. The inductive method works on principles deduced from existing patterns, and therefore, at best, it can only produce the old thing with a new appearance. But the deductive method works in accordance with the essence or spirit of the principle and does not depend on any previous concrete manifestation to be apprehended. And this latter method of work must necessarily be that of the originating mind, for there is no pre-existing pattern from which it could learn the principles of construction. Thus, the universal mind must act deductively, that is, according to the law that has been found true for the individual subjective mind. It is not limited by anything pre-existing, which means that its creative power is absolutely unlimited. And as it is essentially subjective mind, and not objective mind, it is entirely sensitive to suggestion. It is inevitable to infer the identity of the law that governs both the individual and universal subjective mind. As by suggestion, we can imprint a certain character of personality in the individual subjective mind, we can also do so in the universal mind. That is why I have drawn attention to the personal quality of the pure mind when contemplated at its innermost level. The character with which we will invest the universal mind thus becomes the most important consideration of all. As our relationship with it is purely subjective, it will infallibly produce for us exactly the character we have impressed upon it. In other words, it will be for us exactly what we believe it to be. This is a simple logical inference from the fact that, as subjective mind, our primary relationship with it can only be on the subjective plane, and indirectly our objective relationships must also find their foundation in the same source. This is the meaning of the remarkable passage twice repeated in the Bible. "With the pure you show yourself pure, and with the crooked you show yourself perverse." Psalm 18:26. From the context, it is clear that these words are addressed to the divine being. The spiritual kingdom is within us, and as we understand it, it becomes a reality for us. This is the invariable law of subjective life, that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. This amounts to saying that his internal subjective state is the only true reality, and what we can call external reality is only its objective correspondence. If we fully realize the truth that the universal mind is exactly as we conceive it to be, and that this relationship is not merely imaginary, but that, by the law of the subjective mind, it is to us an actual fact and the foundation of all other facts, then the conception of the universal mind that we adopt is extremely important. For the uninitiated, there is little or no choice. They form an idea in accordance with the tradition they have received from others, and as long as they do not learn to think for themselves, they will remain in the results of that tradition. Natural laws admit of no exceptions, and yet, however imperfect the traditional idea may be, its acceptance will lead to a corresponding reaction in the universal mind, which will be reflected in turn in the conscious mind and in the outer life of the individual. But those who understand the law of the subjective mind will have no one to blame if they do not obtain all its benefits. The greatest master of mental science that the world has seen has widely disseminated simple rules for our application, with a knowledge of the subject of which the depth can only be appreciated by those who have practical experience of it. He paints to his ignorant audiences, who listen to him with joy, an image of the universal mind as that of a benevolent father, tenderly compassionate, sending the riches of nature alike to the good and to the wicked. But he does it also to help particularly those who recognize his will, to the point that even the hairs of your head are all counted, and you are worth more than many sparrows. If prayer addressed to the invisible being is said without doubt and fear, with the absolute assurance of a certain response, then no limit is imposed on its power or its will to work for us. But for those who do not understand, great intelligence is necessarily the adversary that sends them to prison until they have fully paid the past. And so, in all cases, the master impresses upon his listeners the exact correspondence between the attitude of this invisible power towards them and their own attitude towards him. This teaching is not a limited anthropomorphism, but an adaptation to the intellectual capacity of the masses and literate of the very profound truths of what we now call mental science. And the basis of all this is the cryptic personality of the hidden mind through the infinity of nature, under every form of manifestation, as pure life and intelligence. It cannot be anything other than good, cannot harbor any intention of evil, and therefore any evil intention puts us in opposition to it, deprives us of the consciousness of its guidance and strength, and thus leaves us to try our own way and fight our own battle, alone against the universe which, given its inequality, will surely prove too great for us. But remember that opposition cannot be part of the universal mind, which is itself the subconscious mind, and to suppose any active opposition taken of its own accord is contrary to everything we have learned about the nature of the subconscious mind, both in the individual and in the universal. The position of the universal mind towards us is always a reflection of our own attitude. Therefore, even if the Bible is full of threats against those who insist on conscious opposition to the divine law of good, it is also full of promises of immediate and complete forgiveness to anyone who changes their attitude and wishes to cooperate with the law of good, as they know it. The law of nature does not act by vengeance, and through all theological formulations and traditional interpretations, we understand that we are dealing with the supreme law of our own being. And this is at the basis of the natural law that we find in the statements of Ezekiel 18:22, which say that if we forsake our wrong ways, our past transgressions will never be remembered against us. We are dealing with the great principle of our subjective being, and our misuse of it in the past can never change its inherent law of action. If our way of using it in the past has brought us pain, fear, and trouble, we have only to turn to the law, for if we reverse the cause, the effects will also be reversed. And what we must do is simply reverse our mental attitude, and then trying to act with the new is essential, the sincere attempt to act with our new mental attitude, not really thinking one way and acting another. But our repeated failures to act fully as we wished should not discourage us. The essential thing is sincere intention, and this will eventually free us from the slavery of habits that currently seem almost insurmountable. In conclusion, the initial step consists in affirming an image of the universal mind as the ideal of everything we could wish for ourselves and for others, with the intention of reproducing this ideal, albeit imperfectly, in our lives. Having taken this step, we can then see it as our ever-present friend, providing all good preserved from all danger and guiding us with all counsel. Gradually, as the habit of perceiving the universal mind in this way grows within us, we will find that, in accordance with the law we have considered, it will become increasingly personal to us. In response to our desires, its inherent intelligence will become more and more clearly perceptible to us as a power to perceive truth beyond any assertion we could formulate through mere intellectual inquiry. Likewise, if we think of it as a great power dedicated to providing all our needs, we will also imprint this character upon it, and by the law of the subconscious mind, it will proceed to decree the share of this special providence that we have accredited as ours. And if beyond the general care of our occupations, we want to attract some particular advantage to ourselves, the same rule will work correctly, imprinting our desire on the universal mind. And if we understand that above and beyond all this, we want something greater and more enduring, such as character building and the unfolding of our powers, so that we may fully develop within us life and joy, the same rule will work correctly. We will communicate our desire to the universal mind, and by the law of the relationship between subjective and objective mind, it will also be accomplished. And so all this reflection brings us back to the ancient affirmation of the law: ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. This is the maximum formulation of the natural law of the relationship between us and the divine spirit. It is not a vain boast that mental science can empower us to create the life we desire. We must begin where we are now, and by a right estimation of our relationship with the universal divine spirit, we can gradually grow into any condition we desire, provided that we first familiarize ourselves with the mental attitude corresponding to those conditions. Because we can never surpass the law of correspondence, and the externalization will always be in accordance with the internal principle that prompts it. For this law, there is no limit to what it can do for us today, tomorrow, and through all the succession of mornings that fade into the distant horizon of eternity. To believe in limitation is the only thing that causes limitation, for we impress limitation into the creative principle, and as we dispel these beliefs, our horizons expand, life increases, and more abundant blessings are ours. However, we must not neglect our responsibilities. Trained thought is more powerful than untrained thought, and therefore, the deeper we delve into mental science, the more precautions we must take against all thoughts and words expressed, even in different forms of hostility, gossip, ridicule, invented tales, which are not in line with the principles of mental science. And likewise, even our smallest thoughts of good carry within them the seed of good, which will surely bear fruit in due time. This is not simply a holy lesson, but an important lesson in mental science for our subjective mind, which takes its color from our permanent mental habits. An occasional affirmation or denial will not be sufficient to change them. Therefore, we must cultivate the tone that we wish to see reproduced in our mental, physical, or circumstantial conditions. In these lectures, my aim has been not to give too many specific practice rules, but to expand upon the general principles of mental science, allowing the student to form their own rules in every path of life. Book knowledge is only a means to an end. Books can only show us where to look and what to look for, but we must find for ourselves. So, if you have truly learned the principles of science, you will establish your own rules, which will give you better results than any attempt to follow another method that succeeded in those hands precisely because they belonged to them. Never doubt yourself. If mental science does not teach you to be yourself, it teaches you nothing. Being oneself, even more oneself, is what you want, only with the knowledge that the true self includes the inner and the supreme self, which is always in immediate contact with the great divine spirit. As Walt Whitman said, "You are more than what lies between your hat and your boots." The increasing popularity of the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science has led me to add to this edition 3 additional chapters: Body, Mind and Soul, with which I hope to demonstrate more clearly the principles of the interaction of these 3 factors. Some students find it difficult to understand how mental action can produce a real effect on material substance. But if this were not possible, mental science would not exist. Its purpose is to produce better conditions both in the body and in the environment, so that the ultimate manifestation is always a demonstration in the realm of the visible and the concrete. One of the most important points in the course of our studies, therefore, is to produce the conviction that there is an actual connection between the visible and the invisible, between the internal and the external. The existence of this connection must be proved by the metaphysical argument which answers the question of how something came to exist. Complete creation, including us, is the proof of this great truth. For some people, purely abstract arguments are not entirely convincing, but they may be a little more so if supported by something more concrete. For these readers, I will therefore give some explanations on the correspondence between the physical and the mental. Although the subject is vast and the limited space of my exposition allows me only a touch on a few suggestive points, these may suffice to show that abstract arguments have some concrete facts to support them. One of the most convincing proofs I have seen is produced by the biometer, a small instrument invented by the eminent French scientist Dr. Hippolyte Baraduc. This instrument shows the action of what he calls vital activity. His theory is that this force, whatever its nature, is universally present and operates as a perpetual physical vitality current, circulating with more or less energy through every physical organism and can somehow be controlled by the power of human will. The theory as a whole is meticulous and extremely elaborate and has been described in detail in Dr. Baraduc's published works. In a conversation I had with him almost a year ago, he told me that he was going to write another book that would shed further light on this subject, but a few months later, he passed away before presenting his work. However, the fact that I would like to offer to the reader is the demonstration of the connection between mind and matter that a biometer produces. The instrument consists of a glass bell in which is suspended a copper needle by a fine silk thread. The glass rests on a wooden support, beneath which is a coil of copper wire that is, however, not connected to any battery or other apparatus, and serves only to condense the current below the needle. Inside the glass is a circular card divided into degrees, which marks the action of the needle. 2 of these instruments are placed side by side, but without connecting them, and the experimenter approaches his fingers from both hands about an inch inside the glass. In accordance with the theory, the current enters the left hand, circulates through the body, and exits through the right hand, which means there is an entry on the left and an exit on the right, corresponding to Reichenbach's experiments on the polarity of the human body. I must confess that, although I read Dr. Baraduc's book, The Vibrations, I approached the instrument with a skeptical attitude. However, I was quickly convinced of my error. First, I adopted a mental attitude of total relaxation. I found that the needle on the left side was attracted by about 20 degrees, while the needle on the right side, affected by the outgoing current, was pushed back by about 10 degrees. After allowing the instrument to return to its normal balance, I approached it again with the aim of seeing if a change in mental attitude could alter the flow of the current. This time, I adopted a stronger mental attitude, intending to direct the flow through the right hand, and the result compared to the previous one was remarkable. The left needle was attracted by 10 degrees, and the right one was pushed back by more than 30 degrees, clearly indicating the influence of mental faculties on modifying the action of the current. I can mention that the experiment was conducted in the presence of 2 physicians who noted the movement of the needles. I will not dwell here on the discussion of the constitution of this current of vital energy. It suffices for our purpose that the experiment I described confronts us with the fact of a correspondence between our mental attitude and the invisible forces of nature. Whether we say that this current is a form of electricity and that the variation of its action is determined by changes in the polarization of the body's atoms, or that this change in polarity is the result of mental action, Whether the acceleration or deceleration of cosmic force is also the result of mental attitude, whether our mental force acts directly on the current itself or indirectly by inducing changes in the molecular structure of the body. Whatever hypothesis we adopt, the conclusion is the same. The mind has the power to open or close the door to invisible forces so that the result of mental action manifests in the material plane. Research shows that the physical body is a mechanism specially adapted to transmute internal or mental power into modes of external activity. We know from medical science that the entire body is traversed by a network of nerves that serve as channels of communication between the inner dwelling, the spiritual ego we call the mind, and the functions of the external organism. The nervous system is dual, one system known as the sympathetic, being the channel for all activities not consciously directed by our will, such as the functioning of the digestive organs, the repair of daily wear and tear of tissues, etc. The other system, known as the voluntary or cerebrospinal system, is the channel through which we receive conscious perception of physical senses and exercise control over body movements. This system has its center in the brain, while the other has its center in the mass of ganglia behind the stomach, known as the solar plexus, sometimes called the abdominal brain. The cerebrospinal system is the organ of conscious mind, and the sympathetic is the organ of the unconscious mind that sustains the vital functions of the body unconsciously. Thus, the cerebrospinal system is the organ of the conscious mind, and the sympathetic is that of the unconscious mind. However, the interaction of the conscious mind with the subconscious requires a similar interaction between corresponding systems and a connection provided by nerves. The network of these makes man physically a single unit. On the other hand, the faculty of intuition corresponds to the upper region of the brain, situated between the frontal area and the posterior region. Physiologically speaking, this is where intuitive ideas enter. Initially, they are more or less uniform and generalized in character, but they are nevertheless perceived by the conscious mind, otherwise we could not be aware of them. So, nature's effort is to bring these ideas into a more defined and usable form, so that the conscious mind can take them and induce a corresponding vibration in the voluntary nervous system. This, in turn, induces a similar vibration in the voluntary system, thereby transmitting the idea to the subjective mind. The vibration, which initially descends from the crown of the brain to the frontal area through the voluntary system to the solar plexus, is now reversed and ascends from the solar plexus to the posterior region of the brain. This indicates that this current returns to the action of the subjective mind. The area of the brain called the corpus callosum is the point of union between the subjective and the objective. When the current returns from the solar plexus to this point, it is restored in the objective part of the brain in a pure form, acquired by the silent alchemy of the subjective mind. Thus, the conception that was initially vaguely recognized is restored by the objective mind in a defined and workable form. By acting through the frontal area, the area of comparison and analysis, one works on a clearly perceptible idea and extracts the potentialities latent within it. It should be noted that I speak of the mental ego in this mode of its existence with which we are familiar. Although there may be much to say about other modes of its activity, for our everyday life it suffices to consider the physiological correspondence of the body with mental action. However, it is always important to remember that the origin of ideas is purely mental, but it should not be forgotten that on the physical plane every mental action involves a corresponding molecular action in the brain and the rest of the nervous system. If, as the old poet says, the soul is the form that creates the body, it is clear that the physical organism must have a mechanical disposition specially adapted to the use of soul power, just as a steam engine is for steam power. The recognition of this reciprocity between the two is the basis of all spiritual or mental healing. Therefore, the study of this mechanical adaptation is an important branch of mental science. However, it is essential to remember that it is the effect and not the cause. It is important to note that the relationship between cause and effect can be reversed in the same way that a device can generate mechanical energy by the application of electricity. or generate electricity by the application of mechanical energy. The importance of this principle lies in this: there is always a tendency for actions that were initially voluntary to become automatic, moving from the region of conscious mind to the subconscious mind and acquiring a permanent residence there. Professor Elmer Gates of Washington demonstrated this physiologically in his studies on the brain. He tells us that every thought produces a molecular change in the substance of the brain, and the repetition of the same class of thoughts causes a repetition of the same molecular action, until finally, a true channel is formed in the brain substance, which can only be eradicated by a reversal of the thought process. Thus, thought grooves are a very literal thing, and when the vibration of the cosmic current is established, it automatically circulates through them, reacting in the mind and affecting what we imprint voluntarily and involuntarily in the invisible. In this way, so-called habits are formed, and hence the importance of controlling our thoughts and guarding them against undesirable ideas. On the other hand, this process of reaction can be used to affirm a positive and beneficial thought, so that with the knowledge of this law, we can engage the physical body in constructing a perfect integral personality, which is the goal of our studies. Chapter 15. The Soul. Having gained an insight into the adaptation of the physical organism to the action of the mind, the next thing we need to understand is that the mind itself is an organism that adapts in the same way to the action of a higher power. However, here adaptation is to a mental faculty, just as with other invisible forces. All we can know about the mind is by observing what it does, but with the difference that we are this mind, and our observation is an internal observation of states of consciousness. In this way, we recognize certain faculties of our mind, which have been considered previously. But the point I want to draw attention to is on those faculties that always work under the influence of something that stimulates them. And this stimulation can come as much from the outside, through the external senses, as from the inside, by the consciousness of something invisible on the physical plane. The recognition of these internal sources of stimulation of our mental faculties is an important subject of mental science, as mentally structured action operates precisely through physical correspondence, just as those that begin with the recognition of external facts. Therefore, the control and proper direction of these internal perceptions are a matter of great importance. The faculties that concern us most immediately are intuition and imagination, but it is difficult at first to see how intuition, which is entirely spontaneous, can be brought under the control of the will. Of course, the spontaneity of intuition cannot in any way be hindered, for if it ceases to act spontaneously, it ceases to be intuition. The question is to capture ideas from the infinite and present them to the mind for distribution at its discretion within our mental constitution. It is the point of origin, and therefore ceasing to act spontaneously should mean ceasing to act altogether. However, experience shows that intuition can be trained to increase its sensitivity in a particular direction, and the choice of the general direction is determined by the individual's will. Intuition operates more rapidly in subjects that most often occupy our thoughts, and in accordance with physiological correspondence, we find the formation of brain channels specially adapted by induction into the molecular system of vibrations corresponding to the particular class of ideas in question. But of course, we must remember that ideas are not caused by molecular changes, but on the contrary, they are the cause of them. And it is in this translation of the action of thought into physical action that we are confronted with the eternal mystery of the descent of the mind into matter. We can follow this thought through successive degrees of refinement until it becomes, compared to those dense modes familiar to us, a spiritual substance, but not yet the principle of intelligent thought itself. The key lies in the word vibration. The movement of substance begins with the vibration of its particles, and a vibration is a wave of a certain amplitude and periodicity, which means something that can exist only in terms of space and time. And as soon as we deal with something capable of being measured, we are certain that we are not dealing with the mind, but only with one of its vehicles. Therefore, as far as we can push our analysis of the question, and although we have already acquired much knowledge, we will find that the point where spiritual power or the force of thought is translated into etheric or atomic vibration, will always elude us. Thus, we should not attribute the origin of ideas to molecular movement in the brain, even though, by the reaction of the physical on the mental which we have previously discussed, the formation of thought channels in the grey matter of the brain may tend to facilitate the reception of certain ideas. Some people are currently aware of the action of the upper part of the brain during the influx of an intuition, feeling a sort of expansion in the brain region that can be compared to the opening of a valve or a door. However, any attempt to induce the influx of intuitive ideas by the physiological means of attempting to open this valve through the exercise of will should be discouraged, as it can cause damage to the brain. I believe some Eastern systems encourage this method, but we can trust the mind to regulate the action of its physical channels in a manner suitable to its own requirements, rather than wanting to manipulate the mind through the artificial constraint of its mechanical instrument. In all our studies, we must remember that development always takes place by perfect natural growth and is not brought about by forcing any part of the system. The fact is that intuition operates more freely in the direction where we most often concentrate our thoughts, and in practice the best way to cultivate intuition in a particular direction is to meditate on the abstract principles of that particular class of subjects. The reason may be that particular cases are specific phenomena. That is, the law operates under certain limited conditions, while the principle of the law is not limited by local conditions. Habitual meditation leaves it free for our intuition to expand infinitely, where the conception of previous conditions does not limit it in any way. Whatever the theoretical explanation, you will find that clear understanding of abstract principles in any direction has a wonderful accelerating effect on intuition. In a particular direction, the importance of recognizing our power to direct intuition cannot be overstated. If the mind is attuned to the highest phases of the spirit, this power opens the doors to unlimited possibilities of knowledge, and in its highest work, intuition becomes inspiration. Some great records of fundamental truths and supreme mysteries, which may be considered of spiritual origin, have been handed down to us by generations of deep thinkers from antiquity. Connected with reverent worship, they have opened the door through their intuitive faculty to the most sublime inspirations of the supreme truths of the universe, both regarding the evolution of the cosmos and individual evolution. Among these explanatory records of supreme mysteries, 3 stand out, all bearing witness to the same truth, and each shedding light on the other: the Bible, the Great Pyramid, and the deck of cards. A curious combination, some might think, but I hope to justify this assertion in another volume of this series. I refer to these 3 records here because the unity of the principle they exhibit, despite their wide divergence of method, produces tangible evidence that the direction taken by intuition is primarily determined by the individual's will. Associated with intuition is the faculty of imagination. This does not mean mere fantasies that we would dismiss without further consideration, but our power to form mental images in which to dwell. As I mentioned earlier, they form a nucleus that, on its own plane, calls into action the universal law of attraction, thus setting in motion the principle of growth. The relationship of intuition with imagination is that intuition takes an idea from the great universal intelligence, in which all things subsist as potential, and presents it to the imagination in its essence, rather than in its definitive form. Then our faculty of imagery gives it a clear and definite form, presenting it before the mental vision, which enlivens our thoughts in it, thus infusing our own personality. And thus, we supply the personal elements through which the specific action of the universal law always takes place relatively in the particular individual. Allowing a particular mental image to remain in our thought depends on our own will, and the exercise of our will depends on our belief in our power to use it, as much to disperse or consolidate a given mental image. Ultimately, our belief in our power to do this depends on our recognition of our relationship with God, who is the source of all power. Thus, it is an unalterable truth that our life will take its complete form, tone, and color from our conception of God, whether positively or negatively, and from what we do with what is given to us in this manner. So, our intuition is linked to our imagination, and it has its physiological correspondence in the circle of molecular vibrations that I described earlier, which begins in the upper or ideal part of the brain, flows through the voluntary nervous system, the physical channel of the objective mind, and returns through the sympathetic system, the physical channel of the subjective mind, thus completing the circuit and then being restored in the frontal region of the brain, where it is consciously shaped into well-defined forms suited to a specific purpose. In all this, the power of will regulating the action of both intuition and imagination must never be lost sight of, for without this central control power, we may lose all sense of individuality. And so the ultimate goal of the evolutionary process is to unfold individual wills to act for their own benefit and enlightenment, so as to become vehicles worthy of the expression of the Supreme Spirit, thus pushing the creative process to its highest levels through conscious union with the individual. This represents the only possible solution to the great problem of how the universal mind can fully act on the individual and particular plane. This is the end of evolution, and the success of individual evolution depends on the recognition of this goal and working towards it. Therefore, this must be the grand purpose of our studies. There is a correspondence between the constitution of the body with the faculties of the soul, and a similar correspondence in the faculties of the soul with the power of the spirit, the origin of all. As in all other adaptations of specific vehicles here too, we can never properly understand the nature of the vehicle and use it correctly until we understand the nature of the power for which its work is specially adapted. Let us conclude by briefly considering the nature of this power. Chapter 16. The Spirit. What is the Supreme Spirit, the origin of all in itself? This is the question before us. Let us begin by observing an undeniable fact. It is creative. If it were not creative, nothing could exist. We therefore know that its purpose or law tends to bring individual lives into existence and surround them with a suitable environment. Thus, a power with such characteristics in its inherent nature must be a benevolent power. The spirit of life, seeking to express itself in individual lives, has no other intention than to give them life, and to give it abundantly. To assume otherwise would be a contradiction. It would be to believe that the eternal principle of life acts against itself, expressing itself as the opposite of what it is. In this case, it would not be expressing itself, but its opposite. Therefore, it is impossible to conceive of the spirit of life acting other than to increase life. This is yet only partially clear due to our imperfect understanding of the position and consequent necessity of conscious unity with eternal life. As our consciousness of unity becomes more perfect, the life-giving spirit becomes clearer. It is inevitable to conclude that in the realm of principles, the originating spirit is purely affirmative and life-giving in nature. Now, under what name can we call this inherent desire to increase the fullness of every individual life, to make it stronger, more vibrant and joyful, if not love? So I do not know what else it could be, and thus we are philosophically led to the conclusion that love is the primary motivating power of the creative spirit. But expression is impossible without form. What form, then, should love give to vehicles for its expression? According to the hypothesis of the case, it could not find self-expression in forms that would be hateful or repugnant to it. The only logical correlation of love is therefore beauty. It is not yet universally manifested, for the same reason that life is not, let's say, for lack of recognition of its principles. But the principle of beauty is inherent to the eternal spirit, as evidenced by all the beauty that exists in the world in which we live. These considerations show that the inherent nature of the spirit must consist in the eternal interaction of love and beauty as the active and passive polarity of being. Thus, this is the power for which our soul faculties are specially adapted, and when this is recognized, we begin to have some vision of how our intuition, imagination, and will should be exercised. Training our thoughts to habitually reside in this dual unity of the original forces of love and beauty will allow intuition to become more sensitive to ideas emanating from this supreme source, and the faculty of action will form into corresponding images of these ideas. Even on the physical side, the molecular structure of the brain and body will adjust more perfectly to the generation of vibrational currents tending towards the external manifestation of the original principle. In this way, the whole man comes into harmony with himself and with the supreme source of life. It is, to borrow the words of St. Paul, that he is renewed every day in the image of the one who created him. Our most immediate personal recognition of the origin of all love and beauty will outwardly manifest as peace in the mind, health in the body, wisdom in the conduct of our affairs, and motivation to fulfill our commitments. As we progress in a higher conception of the work of the spirit of love and beauty in its infinite possibilities, our intuition will discover a broader scope, and our field of activity will expand with it. In a word, we will discover that our individuality grows and that we become more truly ourselves than before.